I'm not going to give you long speeches. I just want to thank the sponsors tonight. Rabbi Yossi Paltiel, Rabbi Adam and Chana Nesinov, and Chaim, Dr. Chaim Baki Cohen. I want to thank them for sponsoring tonight's event, tonight's Farbrengen. So I really appreciate it. They should give them all the lyhadus and all the godliness that's going to be built tonight. It should all be on their schus. And you get a lot of brownie points, B'ezrat Hashem. A lot of brownie points. I'm glad to be happy and special. You should realize the treat that we have tonight. Rabbi Yossi Paltiel, he brought here many years ago, and you should go to his website,
Inside Chassidus.
.org. Sorry, Inside Chassidus.org. And you're partially going to be inspired in Chassidus. And that's what we're here tonight, to be inspired with the limit of Chassidus, the learning of Chassidus, the diet of Chassidus, the way of Chassidus. This is what the rebbe stood for. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Rabbi Paltiel, who's going to be here till his flight tomorrow is 6 a.m. So he is available here a whole night. So we're going to have the informal part, and then we'll bring everybody up closer, and we'll have the formal part, and then the informal part. Okay, Rabbi Paltiel.
Okay, Shalom Aleichem, hello. My name is Yossi Paltiel, and I live in Brooklyn. And now I'm in Florida. I've never participated in this kind of a musical event before, Lo Zachiti, and it was incredibly moving. For me, it was wow. I mean, many of you may be used to this kind of ability to talk without words, but they did a good job. They did an incredible job. I was thinking to myself, as I was listening to the music, how am I possibly going to follow that? So they gave us a half an hour interruption so people could sort of calm down from the music and move on to words. I pledged to not at all match the language of the soul that we heard before. There's just no way I could, what's the right word? Say so much truth and keep your mouth closed. It's a good idea to be able to speak without words, but I don't have that skill, I don't have that ability. So we're going to have a Farbrengen, look over Yud Shvat. I'm thanking you for bringing me. I said to my book, when I first got married, I was a teacher, and I was a very, very, very religious teacher. I would do nothing else but teach. And then reality hit, and I started to travel. One of the very first places I visited was Boca Raton, Boca Raton. And we were reminiscing about that Farbrengen. It was also a Yud Shvat many, many years ago. And I was delighted to find out that Mrs. Hensche Gansberg, gesund, who sponsored that Farbrengen, should be Marach Yom V'Shanim. She sponsored in honor of her husband and her father. So these are just memories. I'm going to begin with a formal talk. It's a Farbrengen, but I'm going to begin by sharing some thoughts that are relevant to Yud Shvat. And as the evening progresses, if you'll be kind enough to stick around, in other words, if I will be not that boring and you'll manage to continue listening to me, it'll become less formal, become more of a Farbrengen. We'll sing, we'll warm up, we'll say l'chaim, and maybe something real will come out. L'chaim v'levracha, l'chaim te'emishon, l'chaim v'levracha. L'chaim, everybody, l'chaim v'levracha, l'chaim v'levracha. Rabbi Bucket told me something wonderful, delicious. I'm giving you Rabbi Bucket's wisdom. That when he went on Shlichus over 30 years ago, he went to see Rabbi Yankiv Yehuda Hecht, Rabbi J.J. Hecht, whom he grew up with in East Flatbush. We flew on the same plane, so we drove back from the airport together, so we had a Farbrengen. So Rabbi Bucket told me a delicious thing, that when he went to tell Rabbi Hecht he's going on Shlichus, Rabbi Hecht said, I want to tell you something. That when he was newly married, he took the position of the rabbi in the shul in East Flatbush, where he served as Rav. I don't know the name of the shul, but it was the largest shul in East Flatbush. Pardon me? Meir Simcha Koyen. It was a very, very large synagogue with incredibly important people, very, very prominent members. And Yankel Hecht, Rabbi J.J. Hecht, was 23 or 24 years old. And who would ever accuse a Hecht of lacking in confidence and self-assuredness? But apparently there's limits So he was a little bit apprehensive of taking such a powerful position. So he went into the Frierdiker Rebbe, went to the previous Rebbe, whose yahrzeit is today, to express his concern. And the Rebbe told him, if I don't quote it correctly, I forgive you, Rabbi, red und red und red. Efter wird ein Wort herausgehen von Herzen und reingehen in der Herz von der zweiten Jiden. The previous Rebbe said to him, talk and talk and talk. Don't stop talking. Maybe one thought will emerge from your heart and will enter and touch the heart of another. This is American Judaism. This is American Chabad. You know, the old Chabadniks thought 50 times before they said anything because they had to really mean it and they had to say it exactly with full sincerity. And God forbid there should be the slightest measure of exactitude, of form and demonstration and posturing had to be so genuine. That wasn't the old country. It was a different world. In America, you got to talk and talk and talk, and you hope once in a while you mean it and it touches the heart of a fellow Jew. I just heard this afternoon, so I'm repeating it. You know how public speaking works. You come to town, you talk to the people, and by the time you're done, you know what you should have told them. That's how public speaking works. It's not like I've had many interactions, but you feel. I wrote my talk today 3 times. Once in New York, once on the airplane, and once after I spoke to Rabbi Bucket. I'm ready to write it a 4th time after being with you. The Rebbe, with all the other things that he did, managed an incredible correspondence. He received letters from people all over the world, and almost until the last years, till the late 80s, he opened every letter himself. Nobody helped him with the mail. My uncle, Benjamin Klein, told me the Rebbe got on average 400 letters a day. 400 is nicht kasach. I remember Benjamin. 400, it's not a lot. 400 letters a day. 400 letters a day. If you take a minute per letter, that's 400 minutes. How many hours is that? That's close to 7 hours. Oh my gosh. The Rebbe didn't spend a minute on each letter. He spent much less than that. But as the Rebbe's secretary, Nissen Mendel, writes in his introduction to his book, The Letter and the Spirit, that when the Rebbe would read a letter, you could tell from his response that he read every word and he read what was between the lines. But the Rebbe operated at an incredibly fast pace. And I know this for a fact. The Rebbe opened every piece of mail himself. Every piece of mail himself. He read each letter. He didn't necessarily respond. The Rebbe had piles. Letters that he responded to, letters that he wasn't going to respond to, letters that he took to the oil. The Rebbe had a lot of stuff going on in his room, and the more you learn about how the Rebbe operated, the more you know. His secretary's number one job was not to help him. Nobody moved a piece of paper from here to here in the Rebbe's room. You certainly didn't move an envelope or a bag full of letters. The Rebbe knew where everything was, and if you moved it and you couldn't find it, that would cost him time. Their job was not to help him. They swept the floor and polished his shoes, but that was about it. And the Rebbe managed incredible correspondence, and it took an enormous amount of time. And the Rebbe had one of those mechanical letter openers where he would splice open the envelope from the top, if you could remember those things. By the way, we were always instructed not to seal an envelope. As children and as teenagers growing up in Crown Heights, if you wrote the Rebbe a letter, you were told don't seal the envelope because it's going to take the Rebbe some time to open it. So, but if you sent it in the mail, you had no option but to seal the envelope. And the Rebbe opened every piece of mail himself. So a Yid decided to do the Rebbe a favor. This is in the 1970s, it's a long time ago. He purchased an electromagnetic, an electric, as opposed to a mechanical letter opener. It would slice open every envelope at the top. It would save the Rebbe per envelope a few seconds. If you multiply that times 400, you're talking about real time. So he bought this machine. It costed him a lot of money. Then he didn't have a lot of money. He got the money and bought the machine, and he brought it into Rabbi Groner, Olav Shalom, Achei Temimim, and he said, "I bought this for the Rebbe to save the Rebbe a few minutes a day." It was a very serious gesture. And Rabbi Groner says to him, nah, the Rebbe's not going to use this. You're wasting your time. He says, the Rebbe's time is so precious. If it's 5 minutes a day, that's 35 minutes a week, that's a few hours a year, it's so precious. Why would you not bring this into the Rebbe's room? So Rabbi Groner says, because I know the Rebbe. He's not even going to go near this machine. So this young man persevered, he nudged, he pressured, he bothered Rabbi Groner, and Rabbi Groner acquiesced. He brought this machine into the Rebbe, or he informed the Rebbe that there's a machine that will open his letters electronically, so he won't have to spend the time to doing it by hand. Now, you know how the Rebbe operates. You send the Rebbe a gift, you have no idea what was the end of the story. So the man waited a week or two, and he goes back to Rabbi Groner and says, is the Rebbe using it? He says, of course not. I told you he wouldn't. He says, why not? He can save real time. Because the machine makes a lot of noise. It's a machine, it's an engine, right? I mean, this is the 1970s. The machine makes a lot of noise. So he spent $1,200 then and bought an envelope opener with a muffler that was very silent, very quiet. And he went into debt, literally went into debt to buy this machine for the Rebbe. And he came to 770 and he came to Rabbi Groner and says, this one is quiet, or quieter. And Rabbi Groner says, Zalman, you're wasting your time. The Rebbe's not going to use it. He says, what do you got to lose? Anyway, he brings it into the Rebbe. He waits a couple of weeks. And he says to Rabbi Groner, well, is the Rebbe using the machine? Of course not. He said, what's his excuse now? So he told Zalman Chanan, that's the person. I heard the story from his son. I may have heard the story from him as well. The Rebbe said to him the following, that when people seal a letter, some people seal an envelope using a little spit. Some people seal an envelope using a little bit of water. Und se verana selche, was versieglen a convert mit a trer. And there are those who seal the envelope with a thread, with a tear. And a machine cannot detect that. That's what the Rebbe said. There are those who seal an envelope with a tear. The Rebbe says, I have to open the envelopes by hand, because in opening the envelope, he's relating to the people who are corresponding with him. Rabbi Yossi, ladies and gentlemen, today is Yud Shvat. We mark the passing of the previous Rebbe, who very few of us, if any, knew. I'm named after the previous Rebbe. I had a school teacher who said to me, I had a school, Rabbi Fuchsel, was my school teacher. He said to us in class in 1976, I was 10 years old. He said, for me, Yud Shvat is a bittersweet day. I marked the passing of the previous Rebbe, which is obviously sad. I also marked the ascension of the Rebbe to the Nasi, to the leadership of Chabad and the world. But for you, there's nothing sad about Yud Shvat. You never knew the previous Rebbe. You had no relationship with the previous Rebbe. We're marking the day that the Rebbe agreed, after a lot of pressure, to become a Rebbe, a Nasi B'Yisrael. And again, I wasn't born in 1950, but I heard that people who knew our Rebbe knew a few things about him. And one of them was that he was no nonsense. He wasn't a drama king. He wasn't ever doing things for effect. He was very direct, he was very honest. He said what he meant and he meant what he said. And when people initially proposed the idea that the Rebbe should ascend to the leadership of Chabad, the Rebbe's reaction was so viscerally opposed to the idea that it was frightening. Do you know that in the very beginning, when they proposed to the Rebbe that he succeed the previous Rebbe, he said that if you don't leave me alone, I will leave New York and I will go and hide and you'll never find me. And people knew that the Rebbe didn't play with words. People knew that Amash, as he was called then. So for a year they agonized and they lobbied and they tried all kinds of stuff to get the Rebbe to change his mind. The Rebbe was not a man who changed his mind easily. The Rebbe was a man who was incredibly resolute, very certain. He had a very, very clear, deep mind. And when he made a decision, it was a decision. And I think it's correct to say, I think it's accurate, I think it's historically accurate to say that Chassidim changed the Rebbe's mind. The Rebbe said no, and the Chassidim said you must. And the Rebbe eventually, reluctantly and emotionally and painfully, and said, yeah, he became our Rebbe. I've heard from Elter Chassidim, people who are older than I, that when the Rebbe had that Farbrengen, the first night, Wednesday was Wednesday night, just like tonight, it was a Wednesday night, 71 years ago, Yud Shvat. The Rebbe was supposed to come in at 8 o'clock, he came in 20 minutes after 9, that's where Chabad time begins. Anybody who grew up in Crown Heights, by the way, for the record, you could set your clock by the Rebbe was always on time. The Rebbe was so precise. If the clock said 1:31 when the Rebbe walked into Farbrengen, the clock was wrong. He was incredibly precise, but at that occasion he came in quite late. He went to see his mother, and his mother kept him. The Rebbe left the Farbrengen around the 12:30, 1:45 in the morning, and I've heard it described by people who were there. Old men, out the Yidden in their 70s and 80s, were jumping up and down like schoolboys. The concern that Chassidim had that perhaps the Rebbe would maintain his refusal to take this position had so consumed Chabad for that year that when the Rebbe acquiesced and he formally and officially and without any masks, without any hesitancy, said, I will be the Rebbe of the Kahal Nash. And as it turned out, nobody could have imagined in their wildest dreams what the Rebbe would create. At that time, if he would look after the few hundred Chabad families broken and scattered across the globe, that would have been a great achievement. But the idea that the Rebbe would literally define himself from the first moment as the Rebbe of every Jew on the planet. And he would think especially about the Jews that everybody forgot, living in the places that nobody knew about. And he would find ways to practically, to physically interact with them, to reach them, to touch them, and to move them. You could never have imagined that this is what would happen in 1951. But just the idea that the Rebbe would shepherd the tiny community of Chabad Hasidim that had just come out of the war and had just survived Stalin and Hitler, the celebration, the joy. I heard the names of Yiddelach who were 80 years old, 75 years old, 85 years old, jumping up and down like school children. We have a Rebbe. It was an incredibly real experience. That year was a year of great concern, and the Rebbe's official ascent to the leadership in the Nesias of Chabad was an incredibly exhilarating moment. It was a very, very happy moment. I will be candid with you. I mean, once the Rebbe was turned on, he was never turned off. But I'm not going to say that in the last 71 years we've remained as exhilarated as we were in that first moment. In other words, the Rebbe took the job, right? So he was full force. How do I say this nicely? We got used to him. We were so spoiled. We were so spoiled by the Rebbe. One of the great gifts that we merited is that the Rebbe was always healthy. The Rebbe was not ill. The Chabad Rebbes traditionally were always sick. And they're always traveling to see doctors and to R&R and to get away and to fresh air and quiet. The Rebbe never took one day off. He was physically, superhumanly strong. He carried incredible burden, incredible responsibility, but he never left 770. He was always there. We went on vacation. We came back, he was there. We went to camp, we came back, he was there. The Rebbe was constantly present and was in good health and did the work that he did all these years. But we took, I would say that at some point, perhaps our enthusiasm waned a little bit. And the Rebbe was a bit disappointed. He was still carrying the load and we weren't as excited as we were on day one. But Yud Shvat is an incredibly important day. I say to you that in 50 years from today, this date will be even a greater celebration. And in 50 years after that, it'll be even a greater celebration. Because the contribution, the gift that God Almighty gave the Jewish people by giving us, the Rebbe, and the contribution that the Rebbe has made is only going to be fully understood through the passage of significant volumes of time. Significant values of time. And there's one very critical piece of the Rebbe's story that we all understand. There's one very critical piece of the Rebbe's story that we readily know and acknowledge. And that is when the Rebbe assumed the position of Nesius of Chabad. So he said a Maimer Chassidus, the Rebbe said a Maimer, a Hasidic discourse, Basi Lagani, which was in itself very, very exciting. If you've ever heard the description of it, the Rebbe was sitting at the Farbrengen, and first of all, for those who don't know, they prepared for the Rebbe 2 different seats because they were very, very, very sensitive to the fact that they didn't want to upset him. They didn't want to do anything that would give the Rebbe any reason to be disappointed with us. So they put a chair in the traditional place where the Rebbe Farbrengt, which was in a very funny place in the room. It was in the middle of the room, against the back windows. If you could imagine that, the big shul, which was a tiny little base medrash upstairs, the Rebbe would Farbrengen Shabbos V'Varchim sitting at the head of the table. In the middle of the room, the table went from north to south. And it was sort of the middle of the room. And the Rebbe sat at the head of that table. They put a chair for the Rebbe there. And they also put a table at the far end of the room, under where there's now windows, or there's a bookcase, a little bookcase that was between the 2 rooms, the larger room and the smaller room. And they gave the Rebbe an option. You know, you want to sit in your regular seat, or you're taking a better position because you're at a different station. Rabbi Moshe Herzl Zogazunzain describes, it's on film, you could see him describing it. The Rebbe walked into that tiny little room, and you couldn't put a toothpick. The room was packed. How many people? How many people could fit in that room? 100? 100? It was a tiny room, relatively speaking, but it was packed. So many people came to experience the Rebbe's official ascent to the Nesius of Chabad, to the leadership of Nesius of Chabad. The Rebbe took one step into the room, and there were tables and benches, and people were sitting. A lot of the people sitting at that table were older than the Rebbe, and they certainly were not as good. The Rebbe was 49 years old, 48, almost 49 years old, but he didn't look a day older than 25. He was incredibly healthy. The Rebbe took one look at what was going on. He put one foot on a bench, another foot on a table, and he literally hopped across the room in 2 seconds. Boop! He was the far end of the room, and he sat down in the new seat that they had given him, which was a very favorable omen, that the Rebbe actually took a seat that reflected honor, as opposed to the traditional place where the Rebbe Farbrengt. And the Rebbe talked, and they sang, and they talked, and they sang, and they talked, and they sang. With an old chassid. He was the father-in-law of the Rebbe's secretary, Rabbi Dr. Nissen Mendel. His name was Nemtsov, Sender Nemtsov. He was then probably in his 70s. He gets up on the table, and he says, the sichos are delightful. But we want the Rebbe should say Chassidus. Nimtza Chei, the Rebbe should say Amayim Chassidus, the Rebbe should say Chassidus. And the Rebbe smiled, and he told him to sit down. And he sat down. And within a very short time, the Rebbe had on his table with him, he brought with him to the Farbrengen, the pamphlet, the Kuntres Basi Lagani, which is the Maimer that the previous Rebbe had issued a year earlier for what would turn out to be the occasion of his passing. And the Rebbe opened it up, and he began by saying, in an ordinary tone, in the Maimer that my father-in-law, the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, distributed for what turned out to be his Histalkos, his Hilula, he begins Basi Lagani. And you can hear the audio, there's a tape, you can listen to it. You can hear the Rebbe's emotion. The Rebbe says that prefatory line, and you can hear him breathe. And then you hear, Bos, Ilagani Achei Sikalo. And then the Rebbe's quiet. And you can hear the shouting in 770. Stand up. The Chassidim are telling one another, when you say a Maimer Chassidus, you're supposed to stand. And then there's a pause. Zog, the Rebbe continues, it says in Medrash, and the first few lines, between every few words, he stops and he breathes. You could see that it's very difficult for him. But within a matter of minutes, it was flowing like a fountain. And then the Rebbe stops, and this old chassid, Sender Nemtsov, jumped back up onto the table, excited, delighted, and he says, thank God. However, he made a little speech. Wasn't very long, but the speech was, thank God we have a Rebbe, and he made a Shechayanu. He said, Hashem made a Shechayanu. And the Rebbe answered, Amen, along with the rest of the Chassidim. The Rebbe smiled and asked him to behave, to sit down. The Rebbe, they sang a couple of Nagunim. The Rebbe said, more of the Maimer. The Rebbe stopped the second time. They sang some more Nagunim. And then the Rebbe finished the Maimer. And after they finished the Maimer, they sang two more Nagunim. In that initial Maimer, that first discourse, the Rebbe mentioned each of the Chabad Rabbeim 5 times. He said 2 Hasidic thoughts from each Rebbe. He told a story about each Rebbe. He mentioned each one of them by name. And we sang a niggin from each Rebbe. So in the course of the Maimed, if you follow it, you'll see that there's a very clear pattern. Twice he quoted a mystical, philosophical, scholarly idea from each one of the Rebbeim. He told the story of each Rebbe. He mentioned each one by name. And then he interrupted twice so that we should sing on each occasion 2 Nagunim, so we sing a niggin from each one of the Rebbeim. As soon as the Bible was done, the Rebbe said like this, and there's an audio tape, you can listen to it. It's der Herz Achei Yidden. Now, listen to me, people, Yidden. And the Rebbe spoke for 5 minutes. And those 5 minutes have defined the last 70 years. The Rebbe said, if you think you got a guy to sit on this seat who's not going to eat and not going to sleep and he's not going to have a life, and he's going to absolutely exhaust himself in looking out for other people. Now this the Rebbe didn't say, but I'm going to say it. You got that. But if you think that you put somebody on this chair who's going to work and toil and exhaust himself, and you're going to go back to sleep, you're making a terrible mistake. I pledge to work with you, not for you. And the Rebbe articulated one of the classic Chabad ideas, that one of the big differences between the Chabad philosophy and the non-Chabad philosophy is the Chassid-Rebbe relationship. That in Chabad the belief was a Chassid doesn't just come to his Rebbe and take, a Chassid comes to his Rebbe and he gives. And this initial pitch, those 5 minutes that the Rebbe spoke after he said that first Maimer, defines each one of us, every single person who has tasted from the Be'er Mayim Chayim, from the fountain of living water of our Rebbe, whether we're officially a shliach or a teacher or a malamed or whatever we do whatever it is, those 5 minutes define us. And may I dare say, on our bad days, and maybe not on our bad days, they haunt us. Because those 5 minutes are saying, no, do something. Because this is the terms under which the Rebbe took the position he took. That every Chabadnik, every Jew, as far as the Rebbe is concerned, we're all Chabadniks, whether we know it or not. But every Chabadnik needs to understand that the Rebbe is a collaborative, it's a symbiosis. The Rebbe said, I'll help you as much as I could. But I'm not doing your work for you. And that's the story. That is the story. The Rebbe becomes a Rebbe, and he began to use people to maximum efficiency. I'm not going to say that every single person that the Rebbe recruited necessarily conformed, did what the Rebbe said. You'll listen to the stories of those early years, the 50s. There were many seasoned Hasidim around, 770 and Lubavitch, and they had a very, very difficult time with this new Rebbe, with his conquer the world vision, which was, at that time, it wasn't even ridiculous. It was senseless. My father told this to me. The Rebbe reached out to Chassidim who were in a position to collaborate with him and said, do this, do this, do this. Some listened, some didn't listen. And the Rebbe created his own army. He took American teens, boychiklach, and meidalach, boys, American boys and girls, and he invested everything in them. He created them. He gave them an enormous amount of love and wisdom and direction. And he was a very tough boss. He always wanted more. And then when these these kids grew up, they became what are now the senior shluchim, our generals. Then they were young guys, they were young kids. And the Rebbe built an army, and he put everybody to work. And the Rebbe's ability to know which person to put where and which person to give which job to is literally godly. And this is the Lubavitch that we know, where kids are born and raised, and they never met him. They never met him. But it's in their DNA. It's in their hardwiring. It's in their hard drive. It's not in the software, it's in the hardware. You're a Lubavitcher, you got to make a difference in the world. You have to make a difference in the world. Whether you make this difference as a shliach, or you make this difference as an agitator and as a troublemaker, but you got to make a difference. This is how we've been raised this way. It's now 3 generations. There are children, our children are growing up, and our children are having children who never knew the Rebbe the way I did, and certainly not the way people older than myself knew the Rebbe. And the basic attitude that we're alive to find another Jew and help him, materially or spiritually, is the reason the Rebbe is who the Rebbe is. Now, it's blasphemy to say that the Rebbe needs anybody's help, right? The Rebbe is Superman, yeah? And I agree that it is blasphemy, but it's also true that the particular form of using his superpowers, the Rebbe's particular form of using his superpowers, was creating the institution of shlichus. He took young boys and girls who believe me, are not tzaddikim. I mean, Rabbi Buket is a tzaddik, but Rabbi Lieberman is a big discussion, yeah? And some of them are not even Beinim, they're just regular guys, regular girls. And he empowered them. He empowered them. And they became super people over the course of their lives. They became literally, if you do this work long enough, you become holy. By default, the job just purifies and purges, and what's left over after doing the Rebbe's work long enough is that you represent the Rebbe in a real, living, sustained way. And this is why, this is the way we understand it at least, why the Rebbe is the Rebbe, in the present tense, not in the past tense. In the present tense, and everyone talks about Lubavitch, yeah? The best of Lubavitch is ahead of us. The best of Lubavitch, who could ever have thought it? It's 30 years ago, people were thinking that Lubavitch is kind of done. Yeah? The best of Lubavitch is ahead of us, because there's more Meshuggah boys and girls being raised with this, I don't know what they're drinking, but they grow up with a sense of duty, And they find very creative ways. I mean, you're going on shlichus today, you're going to a community where there's no Jews almost, because the places that have Jews already have shluchim. And they figure it out. And they find the Jews that everybody forgot. It's a remarkable thing. And it's anchored in the Rebbe's sacrifice, in the Rebbe's literal, the Rebbe's love, the Rebbe's avos Yisrael, the Rebbe's incredible love for every single Jew. Rabbi Weinberg, Rabbi Yossi Weinberg, Zechenu Livracha, tells a story how he came to 770 at 3 o'clock in the morning. Those who were old enough to remember the days of Yechidus, twice or 3 times a week, the Rebbe would sit and meet people, right? On a regular day, when the Rebbe had a regular day, he went home around midnight. That was it. It was normal. That was afternoon. But if the Rebbe had an evening of meeting with people, he could stay in 770 literally till sunrise. 2 or 3 times a week. In the earlier years, he did it 3 times a week, and then the Rebbe actually curtailed it. The Rebbe's health was still finite, as infinite as it was, and at one point the Rebbe cut back on the hours of seeing people, but he still stayed all night, twice a week. And the cliche was, did Rabbi Chadakov go into the Rebbe's room yet? That was the cliche. Rabbi Chadakov was the Rebbe's secretary. Rabbi Chadakov was a person. He wasn't a Rebbe. By the time he passed away, his eyes were literally falling out of his head. The man slept very little, and he didn't have the physical strength that the Rebbe had. So his body was exhausted. Rabbi Chadakov never went home before the Rebbe did. They would go home together. In the early years, they would walk home. In the later years, they would drive home, and they would chat. He was the Rebbe's, he was the closest person. He was so close to the Rebbe that there are no stories about him. You know that? You can tell stories about Rabbi Groner. There's no stories about there's just no stories, because he had no identity. He was the Rebbe's shadow. And he would sit in a tiny little room, and he would never afford himself air conditioning because it was a waste of stock of money. You could faint in that office. And he was asleep and awake, and he would stay there all night until the Rebbe went home. And it was torture. But he sat in that office. People came to see him and talk to him. Again, the way I understand it was he wasn't as alert as the Rebbe was at 4 o'clock in the morning. But when Yechidus was over, when the Rebbe saw his last person, Rabbi Chadakov would leave his office, walk down the hallway, and enter into the Rebbe's room with the last correspondence, the mail that came in the middle of the night, because there was no day and no night in 770. Once Rabbi Chadakov walked into the Rebbe's room, the day was closed. You had to wait till the next morning. And on regular weekdays, if it wasn't a Monday or a Thursday, the Rebbe could come as late as noon. So if you had a question that was urgent, that you needed to get to the Rebbe at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning, you'd call a Crown Heights acquaintance and say, do me a favor, run to the Kadastira Mikveh, which was open 24 hours a day, dunk, run to 770, write a note, and make sure you get it in before Chadakov goes into the Rebbe. Because once Chadakov was into the Rebbe, the day was closed. Rabbi Weinberg got such a phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning from overseas. He ran to Kadastira Mikveh, he dunked, he ran to 770, he wrote his note, and he dashed to the door of the Rebbe, and they told him, too late. Rabbi Chadakov had already entered the Rebbe's room, so he would have to wait till tomorrow. So he put the envelope in the door, in the crack of the door, hoping that when Rabbi Chadakov would leave the Rebbe's room, he'd open the door, he'd see the envelope, and he would drop to the floor, he'd pick it up and hand it to the Rebbe. Well, Rabbi Chadakov didn't notice it. Rabbi Weinberg watched. Rabbi Chadakov opened the door, the envelope fell to the ground, Rabbi Chadakov walked out, and he watched the Rebbe bend down and pick it up. And he felt, and within 5 minutes he had an answer. Before the Rebbe left, he answered his question. But he felt terrible, he made the Rebbe bend down. So he wrote the Rebbe a note of apology. And the Rebbe answered his apology note. This is my entire purpose, to raise up, especially those things that everybody else forgot. That's how the Rebbe worded it. This is my entire purpose, to lift people up, and particularly those things that everybody else forgot. That's what the Rebbe was busy with. So, what can I say? Thank God, yeah, thank God. Thank God. Alter Rebbe had a chassid. His name was Rabbi Yisrael. He was a very great man. If he hadn't been a chassid, he said about himself, if I had not been a chassid, I would have been a shachan taz. He would have written a commentary on Shulchan Aruch of the greatest sages ever. He was an incredibly great man. Rabbi Isaac, but he was a chassid. He really got it. He wasn't only a scholar. He had a sense of the soul of a rebbe, the neshama, the soul, the spirit, the fire, the transcendent. And he drank the water. He was a real chassid. And he was Ma'arech Yom. He lived a very, very long time. Each year he would celebrate Yud Kislev, which was then the great Chabad holiday when the Alter Rebbe was released from prison. So he's famous for having said once, he sat at a Farbrengen Yud Kislev, and he said, when the Alter Rebbe sat in prison, he was delighting, he was enjoying the fact that he was being prosecuted, that he was being held accountable for the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. In other words, to him, the entire incarceration was a nirvana. It was an occasion of great celebration. I'm sitting in jail for my Rebbe. That's how he looked at it. And whatever, a bunch of details that are not important. The bottom line is, when the Alter Rebbe sat in prison, he was doing great. So when the Alter Rebbe left the prison, Rabbi Isaac, this great chassid, said, whom did God Almighty do a favor to? The Rebbe. He was happy to sit in jail for his Rebbe. And he went through a whole series of options, and then he said famously, Rabbi Isaac Homler said, La Hashem HaYeshua. When God Almighty took the Alter Rebbe out of prison, he did himself a favor. When God Almighty took this incredible neshama and put him in our time, at a moment in our history, how far into our past would you need to go to appreciate how critical the entire Jewish world, Sadim and Ashkenazim, Ashkenazic Jewry certainly, but you have to remember, people know, nobody wants to tell you this, right? Who paid the price? Who were the victims? And I don't mean this in a pejorative way, I mean this factually, for the establishment of the so-called modern state of Israel. The answer is 2 million Sephardic Jews, or more, who were forced because of a whole new wave of anti-Semitism to leave their native lands. right? In 1945, there were several million Jews living in Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria and Egypt and Jordan and Syria and Lebanon and Turkey and Iraq and Iran. You can count on one hand how many Jews you have in these countries today. And they've been gone from 67 and even before. This is the price for the state of Israel. And these Sephardic Jews, what happens to Jews when they move? What happens to anybody when you move? You lose your roots. You lose your roots. And when you lose your roots, you stop to grow. And you begin to wilt. And you begin to die. And Almighty planted one soul on this earth. And He gave him the responsibility of looking after everybody. And He pulled it off. The world's not perfect. Nothing is perfect. But our relationship with the Rebbe and our appreciation for the gift of the Rebbe, which every day is bigger. Every day, I live in New York. You visit the Ohel. The Ohel is not dominated by Lubavitcher Chassidim. It's not even dominated by Orthodox Jews. Some will tell you it's not even dominated by Jewish people altogether. Everybody comes to the Ohel where they're going to sightseeing. You go to see the Statue of Liberty, you go to see the Empire State Building, and you go to see Queens. No one's coming to visit because it's a tourist attraction. People are coming because it's a living place. We correct to the really important truth of our Jewish identity. In the Rebbe's Ohel, there's peace. In the Rebbe's Ohel, there's incredible peace to me. In that little tiny space, you feel so peaceful. It's a remarkable experience. And people come and spill their kishkes. And they walk out remedied, healed, cleaned. And blessings and miracles. It's unreal. It's unreal. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. And today, we celebrate this occasion. It's a very special day. But as we all understand, as Chabadnikas, as members of the movement, I'm sorry for using those words, that today is not a day to say, yippee, thank God we have a Rebbe, and eat a piece of cake. That too, if you can still eat cake, I don't know, I'm past the cake eating years. Enjoy it while you can. You're going to come into a time in your life that whatever you put in your body is going to haunt you. Not in 20 years, in 20 seconds. So if you can still eat and stay awake and not get sick and your brain is still going to work, ask it today, because it's not going to last forever. I can tell you from personal experience. If I would have figured out sooner that my body doesn't let me eat, I would have stopped eating sooner, so I would have had a few more hours that I wasn't falling asleep in the middle of talking. We all understand, Rabbi Yossi, that today is a day that commands and obligates. This Rebbe of ours made everybody responsible. And you couldn't be, I don't know how to say it, you couldn't make him happy. He never gave a compliment. How the Rebbe managed to love us and kick us in the pants at every opportunity, it's a special skill. Only a Rebbe can pull it off. We knew how much he loved us, but boy did he ruin our life. The guilt! Whoever, which Chabadnik ever felt satisfied in the Rebbe's presence? Rebbe, I did something good. Yeah! That's all you did? That's all you did? I heard a story recently. Rabbi Lipsker from South Africa, Rabbi Mendel Lipsker went to South Africa and he mamish did miracles. He did miracles. His success in the early years before the Rand fell was extraordinary. And he tells the story himself. He was in the Rebbe's room. And the Rebbe said to him something which he almost never said to anybody. In Yiddish, the Rebbe spoke, "Was soll ich dir sagen? What should I tell you? Als ich bin zufrieden, that I'm impressed, that I'm satisfied. Sag ich dir, als ich bin zufrieden, I'm impressed." And the Rebbe wasn't in the habit of saying that. And then the Rebbe proceeded to tell him that it's not enough, and he kicked him in the pants and said, let's do even more. This is our identity. It's mamish our identity, and it defines us. The Rebbe demands 1,000%, and if he gets 110%, that's incredible. Yeah, I don't know what his thinking is. I just know that he's created Jews who have an enormous sense of duty, and we're so fortunate. We're lucky that we have something to do. Most people would say, retire early, why do I want to work? The Lubavitcher Rebbe didn't understand the word, I saw a quote. Somebody said to the Rebbe, I'm thinking about retiring, and the Rebbe said, I never heard of people stopping to live. That's a direct quote. I never heard of people stopping to live. Retirement? What kind of concept is that? And we're all a lot better than we would be without the Rebbe. It's indescribable. And we all walk around feeling inadequate, not good enough, because we could never deliver as much as the Rebbe wanted. So this is what we are celebrating tonight. It's Yud Shvat. It's a great day. It's an important day. Now, I have 2 pages of notes. I haven't even started. I haven't even read one thing. Like I said to you, I walked into the room and I discovered that the speech I prepared is not the speech I should say. I want to share a few thoughts. I will stop talking at some point. It's gonna happen. But I do want to share a few thoughts before I stop talking for this initial formal round. I want to share some what I think are important, basic, attitudinal foundations of the Rebbe's philosophy and the Rebbe's teaching and the Rebbe's instruction and the Rebbe's inspiration. I think, without a question, the first thing you have to say when you talk about the Rebbe is the word children. Having them and raising them, in that order. Having them and raising them. The Chazal say, the Gemara says, the Talmud says, if you don't have young sheep, you're not going to have... Nobody's born with a white beard. Some people are born with a white beard fantasy, and then they discovered that it means a backache and an inability to sleep and an inability to digest food. But nobody's born old. We're all born at the beginning. Every single one of us was born unknowing, ignorant. And everything we become is an effort. And in the beginning, somebody gave us a lot of attention. Somebody cared enough about who we were and what we stood for. And even though we were little kids and we were obnoxious and we were not paying attention and we had ADD, somebody thought enough of us to focus on us and engage in us so that we would grow up to be mentioned. And there's no question that when the previous Rebbe came to this country, he began the process, and naturally when the Rebbe continued, all of this accelerated 1,000-fold. It's about the children. It's about the children. It's about little kinderlach. And the truth is, it starts with Taras HaMishpacha. It begins before there are children, right? Everybody talks about Taras HaMishpacha, family purity, right? Family purity, you got to go to the mikveh. Family purity, you got to count days. Family purity, you got to do this, that, and the other thing. Family purity, you know what family purity means? You got to have Jewish babies, kosher Yiddish kinder, who are going to be the next generation. Right? We all know the story. When Moses went up the mountain to negotiate the giving of the Torah with God Almighty says, who's taking responsibility for this? Who's taking responsibility for this? And I'll explain the question. God said to Moses, I'm not into this for 40 years. I'm not into this for 1 generation. I'm not even into this for 3 generations. I'm committing to you till the end of time. Now you tell me who's committing back to me till the end of time. Now, I wasn't privy to the conversation, but Moses could have said such things as well. Okay, God, allow us to live forever, and we got a deal. And God says, oh, well, I'm going to allow you to live forever, but not biologically, spiritually, genetically. There's going to be another generation. You're going to live as long as I do, but you're going to have to make babies and start from the beginning again every generation. And then God repeats his question, who's taking responsibility for this? So I don't know if Moshe Rabbeinu said it a second time. Well, if we would live forever, it would be easier to negotiate this, because it's kind of hard to speak for people who haven't been born yet. And God says, I'm not giving you this Torah till you tell me who's taking responsibility. So the Medrash actually says, it's a famous Medrash. The Rebbe made the Medrash famous. The rabbis, and God laughed. They said, Moshe, you don't listen. You trust rabbis. You trust rabbis. So the prophets, the holy men and women. yeah, that's better than the rabbis, but I don't trust them either. Our Helik Azedis, our holy patriarchs and matriarchs, the power of their soul and their sacrifice is gonna act as a halo that protects and preserves. And God says that's a better choice, but not good enough. And when Moses ran out of stories, he said, we'll give you our children. We'll give you our children. And God said, that's a deal. But we all understand that when you say to God Almighty, I'm giving you my children, you're giving him yourself to raise those children. And the Rebbe's preoccupation with little people, with chinuch, with kinderlach, in every facet, in every aspect, the importance of having Yiddish children and teaching them how to be Jews in a completely crazy world. A world that's every 15 minutes got another idea which is even crazier than the idea before. And the Rebbe provided guidelines, the Rebbe provided direction, what it means to raise a child. And he talked about it, and he talked about it, and he talked about it ad infinitum, without an end. The idea of raising children. The Rebbe spoke to non-Jews. He spoke to parents who are sending their children to the public schools that are getting a parochial, a secular education. And he says, parents, I want you to know that raising children is not the 3 R's. Raising children is not reading, writing, arithmetic. Raising children is not giving them the tools to make a living. Raising children is to give them a reason to live. And you give children a reason to live when you teach them the meaning of life. And the meaning of life is very, very un-American. I'm sorry to break it to you. You got to actually grow up. You can't remain a child and be in a 60-year-old body. You have to grow up, take responsibility. And the Rebbe talked to non-Jews about the need for God in their lives and the lives of their children. He spoke to non-Jews about the idea that a civilization survives not because a policeman stands on each street corner and warns you that if you're going to commit a crime, you're going to go to jail. A civilization survives because the members of that society have conscience. That the members of that society know right from wrong, not because of consequence, but because of a deep inner sense of right and wrong. And that, said the Lubavitcher Rebbe, is rooted in God. And he screamed and shouted and begged and pleaded. We need God in the lives of our children. Because if we don't give them God, we're not teaching them what is the real basis of a sustainable civilization. A society where people follow laws only because they're afraid of consequence is bankrupt. People do the right thing because it's right. And they learn that when they're children. They never learn that as adults. Never. They only learn that when they're little and they're not yet corrupted. And they're innocent and they're pure. And you teach them right from wrong. And you teach them right from wrong on a foundation of truth. Not on a foundation of consequence. This is a classic teaching of the Rebbe. A very, very important teaching of the Rebbe. We are parents. My kids are already little. My youngest is 13 and a half, almost 14. And listen, what did I discover? Oh my gosh, right? Thank God we were stupid, you know. If we knew when we were 25 what we know today. But we didn't know. Baruch Hashem, we had a lot of children. And then I don't know what the right word is. They grew up. And some of them are married, and some of them are looking for shidduchim. Anybody have any boys or girls? I got some of my own. We can talk after hours. We're all struggling with all these issues. And we raised our kids. And we taught them about God. And we taught them about right and wrong. And more than anything else, we taught them by example. This is what the Rebbe gave us and gives us. And in the same spirit, I wish to add one particular point that's very, very important and profound. In 1980, the Rebbe made Tzivos Hashem. This is the 41st anniversary of Tzivos Hashem. The Army of Hashem. Tzivos Hashem was an organization that the Rebbe founded for children pre-bar and bas mitzvah. When the Rebbe founded the Tzivos Hashem organization, the Rebbe himself would meet with the children on average 10 times a year, almost once a month. And he would talk to the kids. Have you ever watched those films? The Rebbe's talking to the children. And he didn't talk to them like a rebbe in the first grade who was dramatic and telling stories. He talked to them the same way he talked to us, in that slow, monotone, He spoke to them from a rebbe. And you look around the room, the kids are playing, they're creeping on the floor. A couple of kids are trying to write down what the rebbe is saying. Most of the kids are falling asleep. And the rebbe spoke to the children again and again and again and again and again. And he talked to them not about Ein Seif and about Atik. He talked to them about the Yetzer Hara. He spoke to them in such a simple language. Yetzer Hara, there were occasions where the rebbe didn't want to use the word Hara. He said the Yetzer. He didn't want to say the word evil. The inclination. And he would talk to the children about self-control and beware of the guy on the left side over and over and over again. But the model that the Rebbe chose when he found the Tzivos Hashem was a military model. He wrote in letters that he took out any kind of paraphernalia and form which would seem militaristic, but it was called the Army of Hashem. And the design of the organization was meant to follow a military design. The most critical component of the Tzivos Hashem campaign was what the Rebbe would say with so much emotion, the commander-in-chief. There's a commander-in-chief. And when the commander-in-chief gives an instruction, what do? You don't say why. You don't say I don't agree. You don't say that I have a new lifestyle which is not conforming to this ancient idea. You say Hineni. You're given an order, you do it. And that's how the Rebbe presented it to the children. And he talked to the children about reward. But not extravagant reward, a raising of rank. You do the right thing, you collect a number of points, you become a sergeant. I don't know, you'll forgive me, I don't know the way it works. A sergeant and a lieutenant and a captain and I don't know the numbers. But the Rebbe wanted the children to understand that the only reward they're going to get is a badge. Not a pizza, and not a bicycle, and not even holy books. A badge, a tiny little plastic badge which says you have risen in rank. Because the Rebbe wanted the children to appreciate duty, obligation. So when the Rebbe found the Tzivos Hashem, a psychologist who lived in New York, who was also an educator, wrote the Rebbe a letter. This is 1982, circa. And in this letter, this educator protests the Rebbe's choice of the word army. And he argues that armies conjure up violence. And in general, armies are a bad idea, and violence is a bad idea. I think we all agree that violence is a bad idea. The question is, what's the best way to avoid violence? Some people say the best way to avoid violence is not have an army, and other people say the best way to avoid violence is to have an army. If you have an army, you don't got to use it. If you don't have an army, then you have to use it. But don't tell that to anybody. That's too commonsensical, and it's not our culture. But he wrote to the Rebbe, why are children using a model of army? It conjures up violence. And then wrote him a letter, which is published in many places. And again, I'm sorry that I have no cards with me. My website is InsideChassidus.org. If you can find my website, and you can find the Rebbe page, and you'll scroll down, there's 45 classes there. I have a class on Tzivos Hashem, and you can actually, the letter, I posted the PDF of this letter, you can take it from there. In the meantime, I just told you about my website one more time. A little more Jewish guilt for the evening. I gotta score some points. In this letter, the Rebbe writes to this professor the following. This is 1980, 81, maybe 82. The Rebbe says, I have lived in this country at that time for 40 years. And I'm watching the societal decline. I'm watching the societal corrosion. Our values are in the toilet. The culture is becoming less and less responsible for itself. And we've descended, says the Rebbe, into a civilization where the only thing they're afraid of is the policeman. And they're not even afraid of the policeman because there's liberal judges in the court, so we let you away with murder anyway. And the Rebbe says no society can survive on fear of the whip. No society can survive on the fear of consequence. Societies survive on people taking responsibility. And I feel like we're losing it. Our civilization has lost the entire phenomena of personal responsibility. There's a right and a wrong. You got to do the right thing, whether you're in the mood or you're not in the mood. Whether you agree with it or you don't agree with it, because it's the right thing. And the Rebbe actually uses the following words. I thought about it long and hard. I thought about it long. For the Rebbe to think about anything long and hard is Quite impressive. And I concluded, said the Rebbe, that what our children need, what our civilization needs, is a dish of Kabbalah sale. Kabbalah sale means the un-American idea, the Rebbe doesn't use those words, of doing what you're told without asking why. Our civilization will not survive, writes the Rebbe, if people don't appreciate that it's not only how you feel. You don't have to agree with it, you don't have to feel you got to do it, or you're not allowed to do what you mustn't do. And the Rebbe said the only place in America where I found any of that is in the military. So the Rebbe sort of indicates, I didn't have a choice. I want to reach children. And I want to teach children, forget the parents, yeah? I want to teach children that there's a right and a wrong. And right and the wrong has nothing to do with how I feel right now. It's absolute right and wrong. And we buy in, we commit to doing right and not doing wrong, no matter how we feel. Because, quote, we accept the yoke of heaven. And the Rebbe said, this is why I founded Tzivos Hashem. To teach children discipline. To teach children the idea that you got to do what you got to do, even if you don't like it. And the Rebbe impressed that not only on the children, but on us, on the parents, on the educators, that part of how we raise our kids, and this is tough. This is tough. Those of you who are a little younger than I and you have still young kids, and not like my kids are ever going to graduate from being my children and making me old. They're doing a fine job, Baruch Hashem. You know how difficult it is, to tell a child they have to do something, and the reason is because you said. That's really the reason. Or to say it in an American, more sensitive tone, I'll tell you tomorrow why. But today you're going to listen. Because I'm your father. The previous Rebbe? You know the story of the previous Rebbe? The previous Rebbe got once a patch from his father. His father hit him once as a child. He hit him very softly, and the Frierdiker Rebbe cried till there were no more tears left in his ducts because of shame. His father tapped him. What was the story? His father walked into the kitchen. He was 6 years old. He was very little, maybe even younger. And he was eating breakfast. And his mother was feeding him. And his father, the Rebbe Rashab, said to him, he always called him by his full name, Yosef Yitzchak, did you make a bracha on the tzitzis? Did you make a bracha on the tzitzis? Did you make a bracha on the tzitzis? So he said, yeah. I did make a bracha on the tzitzis. And his father said, I want you to make a bracha on the tzitzis. But I did already. And his father said, I want you to make a bracha on the tzitzis. Now, I don't know how to explain this story, whether he did or he didn't, but this is the story as it's recorded. And the previous Rebbe said, I did. And his father said, I want you to make a bracha on the tzitzis. And the previous Rebbe said, I did. So his father gave him a patch. His father hit him, slapped him. And he cried terribly. He was so humiliated. He didn't hurt him. I'm imagining that he made a bracha on the tzitzis. His father told him to make a bracha. And later he went into his father and says, for whom do you do mitzvahs? For God or for your father? For whom do I make a bracha on tzitzis? For you or for God Almighty? I made a bracha on the tzitzis. And his father said to him, you're right. Mitzvahs you do for God. But God Almighty empowered every parent to teach his children how to live and how to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the children, therefore, have to listen to their parents. This is a recorded story. It's a recorded story. The previous Rebbe tells the story himself. Now, I'm not saying you should hit your kids. I'm really not saying that. You're not the Rebbe Rashab, and your son is not the Frierdiker Rebbe, and it's not 1880, whatever it is. It's 2022. But the idea that it's our duty to teach our children that they don't only do what they feel like is so fundamental to living, and it is so challenged in our society, and it is something that the Rebbe put so much time and effort into. It's indescribable how much time and effort the Rebbe put into this idea. Now, I really do need to stop talking because it's getting kind of ridiculous. Okay, I'm going to say 2 more points. I'll try to do them quick, and then I'm going to take a break. The first thing I want to talk about is, I said to you that talk about the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the first thing you got to say is children. What's the second thing you got to say? I guess the answer is probably Mashiach. Maybe Mashiach comes first. But the second item on my list, considering the fact that I'm talking for an hour and 4 minutes, is joy. Simcha, joy. Joy. Who's happy? Little kids. Who's happy? Naive people. Who's happy? People who have an IQ under such and such a number. If you're grown up and you're intelligent, you're miserable. Why? It's sophisticated. This is a cliche that goes around and around. What's the opposite of an optimist? What's the opposite of an optimist? A realist. There's not a pessimist in the world that calls a pessimist. Of saying how terrible life is. And it's not that it isn't even true. It's just that we can't afford it. We can't afford it. Who heard more tzadus than the Lubavitcher Rebbe? Who was burdened by the pains of Jews and non-Jews more than this man? You know, they tell a story. I remember this story. There was a kid a couple years older than myself. Forgive me for giving this example. Who was murdered on the streets of Crown Heights in 1977. Avrami Goldman, all of us. He was stabbed in the street. The boys in yeshiva ran to 770. They took him to the hospital. And they ran into the secretary and they told the secretary what happened. And they said, we have to tell the Rebbe. So the secretary let them in. It was a night of Yechidus. The two boys, can you imagine two teenagers running into the Rebbe and saying, my friend was just stabbed. I don't know how long it was, but it was very short. They went in, they told the Rebbe. I mean, the Rebbe was a pretty smart man, and he was on the ball, and he knew things that other people don't know. They were in the Rebbe's room for half a minute. But how would you feel after such a regards, such a piece of information? Those two boys out, a couple walked in. I don't know who the couple is, but they had such a warm meeting. The Rebbe was so kind, and so there was absolutely no detectable sense that the Rebbe was just given the worst news in the world. It's remarkable. Mamish, it's godly. The Rebbe was and is a beacon of joy. And it didn't come from naivete, I assure you. You know, there's a story that I heard from someone who heard it from the person. There was a Yidel that lived in Crown Heights. He was old Polish, from the Atvaske Chevre. He never got married. He was an older guy, and he had some money. And he went from Rebbe to Rebbe. He would wander. He lived in New York, and he visited all the great Jews. He was quite learned. He was a very sweet man, and he hung out in good places. And one of the good places he hung out was 770. He would occasionally go into the Rebbe and chat. He didn't have much important to say, so the secretaries probably limited his meetings. But he was a Jew like anybody else. So he said to somebody that told this to me, that he walked into the Rebbe one evening and said to the Rebbe in Yiddish, "Was macht der Lubavitcher Rebbe?" which translates into colloquial English, "How you doing, Rebbe?" And without a hesitation, the Rebbe said, "Ich bin tomid besimcha." I'm always happy. The adage that says, meet an intelligent person and meet the person who's burdened by life, is true. Unless you have God. Unless you have Chassidus. Unless you have a Rebbe. And this allows you to be stronger than it. It's not that you don't know what life is, but that's not how life is lived. Nobody benefits by being realistic and miserable. Nobody does. Nobody does. Especially the person who's realistic and miserable. So you put your best face on, and you deal with the test that life gives you, and you fight to be joyous. Why? It's called serving God. You keep Shabbos, you keep kosher, you're joyous. Our Rebbe had a generation of misfits. I was talking to a book with whom did the Lubavitcher Rebbe make his army? The Lubavitcher Rebbe's army, a bunch of orphans, people who have enough PTSD for 100 people, survivors of Stalin and Hitler. Those are the Rebbe's generals. There's not one normal one in the bunch. There's nobody around. Either you survived Hitler, or you survived Stalin, or you survived both. Nobody had two parents. Their lives were miserable. They were the big Lubavitcher Chassidim with which the Rebbe made his revolution. Think about it. Now, if they had not been Lubavitchers, they would have been miserable people. They were miserable anyway, but at least they had a smile on their face. The Rebbe created a philosophy of joy, and he practiced it. The Rebbe said about himself, that by nature he's an introvert. By nature he's melancholy. By nature he's not a happy man. He's an intellectual. And he completely transformed himself into a person who was a torch of joy. And he joined us because it's correct and because it's better. Nobody's life is any worse if they're joyous. No one's life is any better if they're realistic, pessimistic. But it's so much easier to go through life when you don't let life kill you. When you don't say, I'm entitled to be miserable because all the misery, enjoy gesundheit, enjoy it all you want. You eat yourself up alive. I'm righteous, I'm self-righteous. And the Rebbe says, Haksta Chainik, you're killing yourself and you're killing everybody around you. Get over it. Not that it's easy. And the Rebbe taught us joy. And joy is not something that you do because you win the lottery. You understand? Joy is something you do if you want to win the lottery. Joy is not the reaction to life. It's the cause. Joy is not what you do because good things happen to you. Joy is what you do so that good things should happen to you. It's energy. It's energy. And the Rebbe gave and gives to each of us in a contagious way that we should pass it along to the next person. Real Yiddish, Chassidish joy. And they call us naive, they call us unrealistic, they call us jumping up and down, call whatever you want, but they're jealous of us. The realists are jealous of the optimists. And one last thing I'm going to say, and then I'm actually going to stop, if you can imagine that. Okay, if my book says I can keep talking. I want you to know I have talked and fallen asleep right in the middle of talking, woken up and continued going, and the students were kind enough to make believe they didn't notice. It's happened. I want to say this to Rabbi Yossi. What is the job of a rebbe? Rosh Yeshivas teach Talmud. Rabbanim teach halacha, right? What does the rebbe teach? What is his wares? What is he selling? What's his role? What is he giving out? What's he making available to the world? And the answer is very simple and very profound. Rebbes, tzaddikim, give us God. Not God's wisdom, they give us God. They give us Hashem. Tzaddikim's role in this world is to make God real for each one of us. By his presence, and by his teaching, by his inspiration, and by his direction. And Rabbi Yossi said about the previous Rebbe, there's a Sar HaTorah, there's the master of Torah, and then there's the Sar HaElokim, he who represents God. That's what tzaddikim do. The Rebbe gives us a relationship with God. And if you grew up around the Rebbe, or if you listened to the recordings, or if you had occasion to be by the Rebbe has expressions that he would repeat and repeat and repeat. Because the Rebbe didn't only teach. The Rebbe didn't only teach. The Rebbe was very repetitive if he wanted to be. The Rebbe inspired. The Rebbe warmed our heart. And if he had to say the same thing 100 times, he did. And the Rebbe had phrases that he coined, that he developed, that he would repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat. We all think it's a Gemara or a Medrash or a Pasuk, and it's a quote from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. One of the most familiar phrases that the Rebbe would say again and again and again to men, to women, to children. And he would say it with a very special intonation, with a special trop. Boirei oilam umanhigoi. He would say it again and again. Boirei oilam umanhigoi. You can hear the Rebbe saying it. The creator of the world and the master of the world. Right? And most people in America believe in God. Right? And most people believe America believe they can do whatever they want. We believe in God who is immanent. He's involved. He didn't just create us and go off to create another universe. He's here now with us. And he's involved in our lives. And on one hand, there's a reckoning, there's a responsibility. And on the other hand, he's, in his interesting way, quite interesting way, he's actually looking out for us. And I want to share a commonsensical thing with you. A very, very simple commonsensical thing. But as everybody knows, common sense is most uncommon. Okay, I'm going to give you an example. Okay, if you're single, don't listen. This is offensive. A boy and a girl meet for a prospective shidduch. It happens, yeah. A guy and a girl meet, and they're meeting. Their job as they're dating each other, they're courting each other, and they're meeting each other. Of course, everyone's on their best behavior, and you never really get to know the person until the day after the wedding, all the rest of the stuff, yes. But they're shopping. They're shopping. They're consumers. They're looking for a product. And I don't mean this chas v'sholom in the disparaging sense. I'm just trying to use simple English words. If a boy and a girl go on a date, and they're not critical, it's a tragedy. When a boy and a girl go on a date, they're supposed to decide if this is the person they're going to marry. So they question and they doubt. However they do it. They ask questions directly, or they watch how people react to different situations. They say things. You're supposed to be critical. You're supposed to not trust. You're supposed to question and doubt and spend whatever time you need using the best tools that you were given, the best judgment you have to determine if this person is right for you. And then they get engaged, right? Then they actually decide, yep, I can marry this person. Nobody ever gets everything that they want, right? My wife will be perfect the same day that I become perfect. It took me 30 years to figure that out, yeah? I still hold it against her, but that's the fact of life. When I'll be perfect, she'll be perfect, and it ain't happening anytime soon. That's life. But you decide to marry somebody. Now listen to this. Once you make the decision to marry that person, the judgment has to stop. Because you need a relationship with that person. You can't have a relationship with a person that every single morning you wake up and you go through the entire computation of why you married them. That's not a marriage. That's a business deal. That's an arrangement. So you spend so much time being critical, and then you tell them, okay, no, let go. Let go. Develop a simple relationship with the other person. You know, the previous Rebbe say, overlook the chesreines, see the milas in an accentuated way, whatever the particulars are. And if a person gets married, now every couple knows this, right? The first year of marriage is the most exciting. And frankly, it's the most difficult. Why? Because you don't stop shopping because you were told to. You don't stop judging because you were told to. You don't stop finding fault because you were told to. You figure it out. You figure it out after 101 fights and whatever else goes on in a marriage, right? Most of us know what that is. And as you're married, unless you burn each other up, right, it could get worse and worse over time. But if you have any seichel, any humility, you figure out, I got to let go of this. Not she has to let go of it. I can go for her. I can only go for me. If she chooses to let go, that'll be good. If she won't choose to let go, that's not going to be good. But by me not letting go, because she's not letting go, I'm not helping myself or her. And you want a simple relationship. Couples who have beautiful marriages just accept. It's not an easy thing to do. But if you don't do that, you don't have a marriage. Now think about this. Let's say, and this is only a let's say, because I don't think there's many people like this, right? You're Abraham. Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu was not a cynical man. He was not a skeptical man. But he was very, very intelligent, and he was very critical. If you told him that this bottle is God, he believed you. But then he asked you a few questions. And if you could not answer the questions satisfactorily, he put the bottle aside and said, this bottle is God for you, is not God for me, because I got questions without answers. If you told him that the sun was God, he believed you. Then he asked you a few questions. Avraham Avinu discovered God through the process of questions and answers. But at some point, Avraham Avinu figured it out. And he made what we call a leap of faith. Which means, I'm not questioning God anymore. I have a relationship with him. We call this emunah. We call this faith. Faith you're supposed to get when you suckle. You understand? Faith you're supposed to get from your mother as an infant, as a newborn. The tragedy, one of the tragedies of the modern world, is faith with an asterisk. You're supposed to believe, but you're too smart to be naive, and you gotta have the proof that you're an intelligent person is that you don't. You see, we need a relationship with God. And the Rebbe gave us God. The Rebbe gave us faith. The Rebbe gave and gives the ability for us to have a relationship with God, which begins when we accept. When we stop being smart. When we stop constantly having to prove it. You prove it. You know, enough. I have to have a relationship with Hashem. And that relationship with Hashem is the basis for our faith. It is the basis for our joy. And it's certainly the basis for our ability to pray. You don't come to shul with a scorecard. You understand, God, you did this to me, and I did this to you, and you did this to me. Now let's make a reckoning. Let's talk about who owes who what. That's not how a relationship with God works. It's a stupid idea, by the way, because we'll never ever know how many things God does for us. He's not going to bother reading us the list. We'll always lose that argument, even though we always think we're going to win, because He does such things as make us breathe every second and metabolize food and oxygen and all kinds of other wonderful things that we don't even pay attention to. But if you want a relationship with God, you got to let go. Just a relationship with your wife. And the Rebbe gave us God. The Rebbe gave us faith. He didn't just give faith to the little people. He gave faith to the biggest people. The Rebbe was such a smart man. And he really believed in God like a child. It's a remarkable thing. He wasn't acting. Oh, this was real. He had no questions on God. He had a lot of complaints. Tons of complaints, more than us. But no questions. You know that the Rebbe's wife, the Rebbetzin, was asked. The Rebbe's Achei was asked what she thought what was the most outstanding quality of her husband. Now what would you say, huh? That he's smart, that he loves people, that he's very devout. The Rebbe's wife said that the most outstanding characteristic of her husband is his emunah, is his faith, is his belief in God. And I dare say that she probably meant belief in man too, because boy did the Rebbe believe in us. My father told me recently, the Rebbe had a much higher opinion of me than I'll ever have of myself. And it wasn't so comfortable. It didn't sit so good. These are some of the gifts, and I can talk and talk and talk. These are some of the gifts that the Rebbe gave us. We're here, we're marking this day, and I want to repeat again. It's a mistake to think of today as a celebration. It is, believe me, it is. Because this relationship is about us and our obligations to ourselves, obligations to our families. We get into bad moods. We have spells where we're angry with God, or we're not sure we're angry, whatever, doubts, whatever, right? And the Rebbe says, cut it out. Stop it. And not because He doesn't care, not because He wants to brainwash us, because it's God. Right thing to do. And this is what this Farbrengen is about. It's about not having a Rebbe, but being his Chassidim. And it's wonderful. It's wonderful. It's mamish wonderful. Thank God. Thank God. But it's not easy. It's not easy. There are other lifestyles that are much easier than ours, and unfortunately not as rewarding by far. This is our schus, this is our achrayus. I'm going to actually say l'chaim and stop talking for a couple of minutes. So I want to thank you all for listening and for staying awake. I consider those two things independently remarkable, and together it's an absolute miracle. L'chaim v'lebracha, I bless all of us. Number one, with gesund, health, and happiness, and success, and hard work, and nachas, and all the other brachas that the Eibishter gives. And we should do what we can, and a little more. L'chaim v'lebracha, l'chaim v'lebracha, l'chaim v'lebracha, l'chaim v'lebracha, l'chaim v'lebracha, l'chaim v'lebracha. L'chaim v'lebracha, l'chaim tev Machon, l'chaim v'lebracha, l'chaim v'lebracha.
It's right in front of you.
L'chaim v'lebracha. You know that there's a lady who lived in Tunisia, and she still lives in Tunisia. Her name was Mrs. Rebbetzin Pinson. I think so. Yeah. Her husband passed away, Reb Nissen Pinson, and she still lives in Tunis. Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, and listen, this woman, she once came to my class in 770. She's regal. You know, sometimes you meet people and they just have a presence. So she tells a story on one of the Gem videos. Tunis was not friendly to Jews, as you may know. Tunisia, right? Moroccan, the king tried to protect the people, the Jews against the citizens. It's an Arab country. Tunisia wasn't punkt azoy. I don't know if you know the story. In hindsight, I remember it happening. The PLO was in Lebanon. Remember, the PLO was in Lebanon. And in 82, we fought a war to get rid of the PLO. We didn't destroy the PLO, we allowed them to move. That was the compromise. The Rebbe was so upset about it. The whole PLO was 5,000-6,000 people then. Now it's a nation. Where did the PLO go? They went to Tunisia. In Tunisia had hundreds of Jews, thousands of Jews. The Sochnut, the Israeli Department for Immigration, came to Tunis, and they said all the Jews have to immigrate because the PLO has come to Tunisia, it's going to become dangerous for Jews. And they, the number one tactic, right? You want to get people to, what's the greatest motivator in the world? Hate. Even worse than fear is hate. Yeah. Hate, get people to hate, get people to be afraid. Yeah. Love is very weak. Love is like water. It's adhesive. It creates bonds, but as quickly as it comes together, it comes apart. So fear works. So they came to Tunisia, and they came to the Jewish community, and you all have to immigrate, move to Israel. It'll be a great mitzvah, v'istachbo, Ben Gurion v'amid al-achas. The Rebbe gave us Tayag mitzvahs. Ben Gurion said there's only one mitzvah. Aliyah, aliyah, aliyah. So they came to the community of Tunisia, they have to make the mitzvah of aliyah, Hazrat Gizak Ben Gurion, because their lives are in danger. And it made sense. The PLO came to Tunisia. And they discovered that the Jews are not in a rush to leave. They were shocked. They thought they're going to offer them some kind of conditions. They're going to come to Israel, they're going to become immigrants, they're going to give them, I don't know what they're going to give them, housing, and I don't know what else, vote for me tickets. But the Jews of Tunisia were not in a rush to move. And they were very taken aback. Because it made sense that they should be afraid. So they started to do research to find out why the Tunisian Jewish community is not rushing to leave Tunis. And they found out there's a rabbi named Rabbi Nissen Pinson, Alav Shalom. And he said not to move. So they came to Rabbi Nissen Pinson and they said, excuse me, Rabbi, I don't know who you are, but you're putting at risk the lives of all these Jews because the PLO is going to come to Tunisia. And if they can attack Jews in Israel, they can certainly attack Jews in Tunisia if they're going to be in Tunis. And Rabbi Nissen Pinson said, I'm sorry, I have my own authority, and I told them not to leave. Who's your authority? The Rebbe. When it became known, I remember the PLO moving to Tunisia. I remember that famous event where Israel went and they killed a guy from the PLO. They came in the middle of the night. It was a great raid. The commandos came. They showed them that they can get him where they sleep. And they didn't kill his wife. They didn't kill his kids. It was a perfect raid. They couldn't have any tightness. So the distant picture said the Rebbe said that it's safe, that the Jews shouldn't leave. But the Rebbe didn't believe in Jews picking up and going in general. And he certainly didn't believe in frightening Jews. If you live in Chutz, the Rebbe didn't believe that the whole Judaism is Israel. He didn't believe that. He believed the whole Judaism is Shabbos and kosher and mikveh and tefillin. You move to Israel if you're not needed where you are, and you're needed in Eretz Yisrael. But Jews should stay where they are. So they made a meeting with the Rebbe, the Sochnut. And the Israeli government, apparently, I don't know this from good sources, but the Rebbe wasn't meeting people privately, but when they came from the head echelons of the Israeli government, the Rebbe would meet them, sometimes in his home, in the middle of the night. The Rebbe would speak to them. They had access to the Rebbe that we didn't have. And they came to the Rebbe, and they met the Rebbe in his house, in the middle of the night, and they told the Rebbe that from their information, the PLO is coming to Tunisia, it's going to become very dangerous to the Jews have to leave, and the Rebbe has to withdraw this order, has to take it back, that the Rebbe said not to leave. So the Rebbe said to them, you have your sources of information, and I have my sources of information, and it's okay, the Jews can stay in Tunisia. They're still in Tunisia. And the PLO is in Israel. So this Mrs. Pinson, they lived in Tunisia. They went on shlichus in the 50s. Originally, they went to Morocco. There was a young couple, they says. The shluchim forever. I mean, these people are so holy. And then at some point, they moved to Tunisia. In the late 50s, maybe moved to Tunisia. They're there. He's deceased. He's passed away, but his wife, I think, still lives there. So it was a hard shlichus. I mean, living in an Arab country was not easy, and there was constant fear, legitimate fear. There were reasons to be afraid. In Algeria, which is also on the coast of North Africa, there was a Yid told me there was a policy that every month they would kill a certain number of prominent Jews. It was a government sanctioned. And a woman said to me that her husband, his father was a prominent businessman. And somebody whispered in his ear that you're on the list next month. He went to Paris on business. and never returned. Just abandoned his whole business and he saved his family. Anyway, so Mrs. Pinson was in the Rebbe's room. And the Rebbe's room, I don't remember Yechidus. I mean, I don't know who's old enough to remember Yechidus. The last time I was in Yechidus in the Rebbe's room, I was 9.5. And I was a baby. I was a very young 9. You had Yechidus, right? The Bar Mitzvah. You had Yechidus. And do you remember?
Why not? We were 12 years old. I was 7.
What I mean, remember, I don't mean you remember being in the room, the experience, the chaviyah, the experience. A 7-year-old is...
That's why we hold the klamke.
The klamke. You're not holding the klamke is holding you. Yeah.
Therefore we hold the klamke. The klamke holds us.
For sure. But I mean, a woman said to me, a lady that used to come to my class and said to me, you prepared to go into the Rebbe. She was describing her Yechidus as, not as a single girl, but as a married woman. You stand in the hallway to the Rebbe's room, and you're so nervous. You're so nervous, you don't know how you're going to survive the experience physically. And you're convinced you're going to go into the Rebbe's room, you're going to get confused, you're going to forget what to say, and you're not going to remember the word the Rebbe said, because you're so overwhelmed by the thought of being in the Rebbe's presence. You step across the threshold, you walk into the Rebbe's room, and a strange calm comes over you. When you walk into the Rebbe's room, the Rebbe embraces you, spiritually. She said to me, I would be outside that door, and I said to myself, today I'm not going to remember a single word. I walked in, and it was so pleasant. It was easy. The Rebbe's presence, Poshet, invited you in emotionally. The woman who's a very sensitive lady who told this to me personally, but I've heard it from others also. When you were in the Rebbe's room, you were sort of held from the top, and you were very calm. You were able to talk to the Rebbe. He asked you questions, you answered. You didn't get nervous. You didn't get entangled on your words. You walked out, you remembered what happened, and then you couldn't understand how it happened. Because in that space, the Rebbe pushed Ufkohim. When you were with the Rebbe, he raised you up to where he was. So Mrs. Pinson says to the Rebbe, in this room I feel so safe. When I go back to Tunisia, I'm always afraid. I want to take the feeling of safety that I have here back with me to Tunisia. And the Rebbe says to her, for yourself, for all the Jews, for yourself, you should feel safe, for all Yidden. She says, I went back to Tunisia and I felt safe. Not only I felt safe, that other people would be next to me, they would say, Mrs. Pinson, how come when we're around you we feel safe? And she would say, the Rebbe is keiches. You have to listen to her tell the story herself. The Rebbe is keiches. You feel safe because the Rebbe is keiches. The Rebbe gave me this gift that I brought from 770, from the Rebbe's cheder. This safety, this feeling of being uplifted. I want to say about Bas Lagani. I don't want to get Haskalah, but I feel like I should. It's Yud Shvat. Bas Lagani. I'm just going to say a thought, and maybe we'll Farbrengen about it. The Bas Lagani. I really don't want to put you to sleep. The Bas Lagani has two parts. The first half of Bas Lagani is about the mission. The second half of Bas Lagani is about who does the mission. The mission is to make the world a Beis Mikdash for Hashem, and he gives 3 examples from Karbonis, from Shtus, and from Sheker. The second half of Bas Lagani talks about who does the mission. And he says the mission is carried out by the Tzivos Hashem. That's what it says. The mission is carried out by the Tzivos Hashem, by the army of Hashem. And then the Rebbe has this famous mashal about different kinds of war. Sometimes a king is fighting a war, it's called Mechemes Nitzachon. And the Rebbe translates the meaning of Mechemes Nitzachon means a war that a king fights, that it's important that his will should happen exactly. In other words, he can't win a little bit, it has to be exactly as he wishes. So the Rebbe says, the previous Rebbe says, when you have a Mechemes Nitzachon, the king breaks all the rules. Number 1, Machnis es atzmei betachsisei Machon. He doesn't trust his generals, he personally engages. which is something that the Frierdiker Rebbe and the Rebbe did, no doubt about it. In Russia, the Rabbeim were busy talking in Yonim Pnimiyim with Greis Chassidim. They trusted the Rabbonim and the Rosh Yeshivas to further the cause of Yiddishkeit. And in America, the Rebbe didn't trust anybody. The Rebbe got involved with everything personally. And you should know, you hear stories. We don't know what happened behind the scenes, but you hear stories. The Rebbe was involved in the tiniest little details of every shliach into the late 80s, not until the 50s or the 60s. Into the late 80s, the Rebbe was on the phone listening to little details about going on in a shlichus in a Fashikta Winkel. He was very personally involved. That's the first thing. Machnes atzme b'tachsisei Machon. He engages in the schemes, the tactics of war. The second thing is, mevazbe is kol ha'etzes. He dispenses of treasure, which has been kept and hidden away for generations. He disposes of the treasure to win the war. And the third thing is mashlachai v'neged. He even gives away his life. And the Rebbe spoke about each of these things many times. The Rebbe also mentioned the mashlachai v'neged. The Rebbe said that now that the Frierdiker Rebbe gave up his life, so we're for sure ready for Mashiach. That's how the Rebbe phrased it. But the Maimer talks about the treasure. Right? The Maimer doesn't talk about the first thing and the third thing. It talks about the middle thing. That the Eibishter is mevazbez kol ha'etzes. So the chapter 12, Perek Yud Beis, this year is, if you do the cycle, Bas Lagani is 20 years, because it's 20 prakim. So from 1951 till 1970 is one cycle. From 1971 till 1990 was a second cycle. From 1991 until 2010 was a third cycle. 2011 is the fourth cycle, and according to that cheshbon, this year is chapter 12, Perek Yud Beis. And Perek Yud Beis begins with the question, Lahavan inyan ha'etzes. What is the meaning of this treasure? In order to explain this, the Rebbe brings that to Kunis Zayir, brings the Kabbalah. A shtickle Kabbalah, a little piece of Zayir. And the Zayir says, Ein seif l'mayla din kef l'mata din tachlis. Godliness, you want to know what godliness is? It's high beyond any end, and it's low beyond any purpose. There's one thing, there's no two things. Godliness is one thing. But godliness has two traits. One trait is that as high as you go, he's higher. And the other trait is as low as you go, he's there. And the Rebbe dedicates there's a big discussion. It goes on for many prakim. It's not a short, it's probably the longest single conversation in the entire Bas Lagani, is to explain this here, Tikkun Zayir. Ein seif l'mayla din kef l'mata din tachlis. What is the way of saying this mystical concept in very down-to-earth words? How do you say this mystical concept in simple, plain English words? The answer is, godliness is something that everybody knows and no one has a clue about. That's really how you translate it. In simple words. Ein seif l'mayla din kef means no one has a clue what godliness is. Ein seif l'mata din tachlis means wherever you go you find God. There's one idea, it's called Ein Seif, and at the same time, he's completely mysterious, and on the other hand, he's totally available, completely known. It's not two levels. It's one idea with two characteristics. The mashal for this that we know from the Maimorim, from the Sichos, is oil, right? It says in the Inside Chassidus. Oil has two characteristics. Characteristic number one is that it floats above any liquid. Characteristic number two, it permeates any place you put it. Chassidus is like oil. It's everywhere and nowhere. Everybody knows what it is, no one has a clue what it is. Ask a person, what's Chassidus? What's Chassidus? What does the Baal Shem Tov want? It's actually hard to answer that question. Everyone has a pretty good idea what it is, but nobody really can pin it down. It's a funny thing, and it makes sense, because Chassidus is not intellectual. Chassidus is spiritual, it's mystical. Chassidus doesn't speak to the mind, it speaks to the soul. And even Chabad, which is such an intellectual Chassidus, if a person gets stuck in the intellect, then he's a misnagdish chassid. He's not this. The ruch, the feel of Chassidus is spiritual. So everybody knows what spirituality is, but no one knows what spiritual is. Everybody knows the impact, how much Chassidus has moved us and changed us. But it's really hard to know what it is, because it's ephemeral, it's elusive, it's, wherever you look for it, someplace else. So the Perek of this year, chapter 12, focuses on the idea that godliness is everywhere. In a later chapter, the Rebbe is going to discuss, no one knows what godliness is. And that's the treasure, that's what it says. The treasure is the idea that no one knows what godliness is. But in this Perek, Yud Beis, Yud Gimel, and Yud Dalet, the Rebbe is speaking of Mata Din Tachlis. And the assertion that he makes, the previous Rebbe teaches it and the Rebbe develops it incredibly in his Maimorim from Chav Beis and Mem Beis, is that godliness is everywhere. Wherever you look, you see God. Wherever you look, you see God. Wherever you look, you see Hashem. If you put on the right set of spectacles, if you look in the correct way, it's impossible not to see God. Wherever you look, you find God. That's what the Maimer says. And it's explained mystically. And the mysticism will live for the mysticai, will leave it for the schmancy, fancy people, for the kluger mention. But this idea, I was thinking what I'm going to talk about tonight. So my formal speech I prepared and I didn't give it. But now it's the Farbrengen. If you prepare a Farbrengen, it's not a Farbrengen. But I did tell myself I need to spend a few minutes talking about Basilagani. And this is what I want to share. The Rebbe explained in the Pedic that begins this year and it continues next year, Yud Beis, Yud Gimel, Yud Dalet. Wherever you look, you see God. Now what's the fact of life? The fact of life is two people could look at the very, very same thing. One person sees God completely, and the other guy sees nothing. It's a choice, right? You look at simple speaking, look at a flower. Flowers are beautiful, right? And if you know my father asks you, why a flower is beautiful? Why? It's a waste of energy. Why a flower is beautiful? Why does it be ugly? What's the difference? There's a biological explanation. And there's also a spiritual explanation. Flowers are beautiful. So one person looks at a flower and he sees biology. Another person looks at a flower and he sees an artist. Somebody made this flower beautiful. And he made this flower beautiful because it was important to him that the flower should be beautiful. Somebody made fruit colorful and sweet and tasty. And some fruit actually literally drip honey. They drip nectar. Somebody thought it was important that there shouldn't only be seeds in pods that are ugly and bitter. There should be seeds and fruit that are delicious, delectable. Somebody cared enough to make this beautiful and tasty and sweet. So one guy looks at this and sees nature. Another person looks at the very same thing and sees God. And this is what the Maimer is teaching. The Maimer is teaching, this is one of the ideas, it's the Basilagani. Ein Seif Lamat Adin Tachlis says, wherever you look, you see Hashem. If you choose to. Now, the Rebbe doesn't say that, if you choose to. The Rebbe chooses for you. The Rebbe what can I tell you? But the Ritziah says, it's a choice. It's a choice. One person looks at Eibishter's world and he sees nature, he sees nothing. Another person looks at the very, very same phenomena. Wherever he looks, he sees HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It depends on the spectacles. It depends on the glasses that you're wearing. It depends on the sensitivity that you have. You want it to be an argument, it could be an argument. But Farbrengen is not times for arguments, it's after hours. Let's talk about the way it is ideally. We're not children, right? There's no children here. We're all adults. We have one child, but if you're here, then you must tell me you're for sure an adult also. And, it's my mitzvah. Yeah. One second. We're not children, we're adults. And as adults, we actually have this choice. We actually have this choice. Little children, b'chlal, live in a fairy tale world. Little children live in a beautiful world. It's really, really, really tragic if a child feels like life is terrible. Children all live life beautiful. Part of that is how we protect them. Part of them is how we raise them. And part of that is who they are. The children look at the world and see beauty. But adults have a choice. Adults have a choice. And some days it's hard. Some days it's hard to get up in the morning and look at the world and see beauty because the Eibush that has made your particular piece of the world. I mean, some of these beautiful flowers stink, you know that? Some of these beautiful flowers, you get close to them, you look up at the picture, they look gorgeous. If you meet them in the jungle, they have a reach nichoyach, they give off a noxious odor, a machaya. But in the photographs you don't smell, you just see the image of beautiful flowers. It's an avodah, it's a job. Ein Sefer Matan Tachas means, this is what it's a message from Basei Lengani. The truth is, wherever you look, you see the Eibishter. The avoida is to look everywhere and see Hashem. And it's not so easy. It's not so easy, but it's true. It's realistic. That a Yid, a Chassid, a human being, a person who's connected to the Eibishter, a person connected to Chassidus, has an obligation to look at the world, look at his life, and see the Eibishter. It's a job. It's an avoida. It's a job. It's a task. I remember, I grew up, I was born in 1965. My earliest memories of 770 are probably around 1970, maybe 71 or 72. We didn't live in Crown Heights, we was in Muncie. But we moved back in 1972, and I have, I think, recollections from that point of 770. But my years of cognizance where I was aware of what was going on, and what the Rebbe was saying was the 80s. My bar mitzvah was 1978, pardon me? So this is Maniyar, the MEMS. My years were the MEMS, the 80s. The Rebbe Farbrengen a lot, Farbrengen often. And in one hand, the Rebbe's Farbrengens were very formal. Right? The Rebbe's Farbrengen sat and talked. He would stop, we would sing, and then he would talk some more. And l'chaim le'bracha, l'chaim le'bracha, l'chaim, right? You remember? You never sang. L'chaim le'bracha. You watch the movies, right? L'chaim le'bracha, l'chaim le'bracha, l'chaim le'bracha. When you look at it on the movie, on the film, it's hello, hello, hello. Please don't forget to check. Hello, hello. That's how it looks. When you were on the receiving end of one of those l'chaim v'levrachas, every single l'chaim v'levracha was a yechidus. It looks so casual. It looks so ordinary. But if you waited sometimes for 4 or 5 sichas to the Rebbe to respond to your cup, you know, and there were thousands of cups. Every moment, and it's a fraction of a second, was an incredibly real experience. It's remarkable. When you experienced it, and there's 2 experiences. One experience is the Rebbe ignoring you. The Rebbe could ignore you for a long time. And when the Rebbe ignored you, you had a pretty good idea why. And when he stopped ignoring you, you had a pretty good idea why for that also. The whole relationship was the eyes. My relationship with the Rebbe is the eyes. But it was a conversation. It was a real conversation. And too many times the Rebbe looked at me and he was just sad. He was just disappointed. It wasn't always, but it was often enough. Nicht zufrieden. And the only person that was you and him. It was very, very private in a room full of people. But on the other hand, by the Rebbe's Farbrengen, especially Shabbos, the Rebbe could get very chassidish, very human, where the Rebbe's tone would become friendly. He was talking to us like a mashpia. We were sitting together at a Farbrengen, but you're sitting with the Rebbe, you're sitting mamish with the Lakus. But the Farbrengen had an incredibly human sense. And you should know, if you listen to the 1979 and 1980, the Rebbe Farbrengen Motzei Shabbos, Saturday night, because of the heart attack. Those audio Farbrengens, they're like Shabbos Farbrengens. It's the Rebbe's tone is different. The Rebbe's relationship, it's a Shabbos Farbrengen after Shabbos. And you listen to those Farbrengens, you have a little bit of a sense of how the Shabbos Farbrengens were different than the week Farbrengens. It was much more intimate. There's no question about it. So the Rebbe was talking about Hashgacha Pratis. I mean, the Rebbe, in one Farbrengen, could talk about 1,000 things. In 20 minutes, the Rebbe could talk about 100 things. The Rebbe he had a lot to say, and he got to the point. It was not so easy to follow Farbrengen. It's not so easy to listen to Farbrengen now. The Rebbe said so much so quickly. But the Rebbe was talking about Hashgacha Pratis. Shem Tov says everything is very precise and so on and so forth. And the Rebbe got really cooked up. Apparently somebody had written the Rebbe a letter complaining about himself and his life and his tzaddis. And the Rebbe by Farbrengen, he didn't say any names ever. But the Rebbe says, Zoller nemen ein Woch von sein Leben. Let you take 1 week of your life, any week you want, and ask yourself how many times in the course of 7 days something could have occurred which would have tipped the apple cart and it would have gone really south. And it never did. It never did. But the Rebbe didn't say it like I'm saying it. The Rebbe said it was a lot of emotion. You don't see God in your life. You don't see God in your life because you're not looking. The Eibishter is in our lives always. And it's our job to see Him. It's our job to see Him. It's our job to celebrate Him. And it really is, honestly, it really is the message of Basi Lagani. This year, next year, the year after. It's a good message to have 3 years to digest. The Rebbe is saying, Ein Seif Lamata L'Tachlis means it's impossible not to see God. Wherever you look, you see Him. If you're honest. I'll tell you a sweet story, one of my favorite stories. Rabbi Glukowski from Rechovis, from Eretz Yisrael, told the story once. Shabbos said he was speaking in 770, and he told the following story: that when he was in yeshiva, when he was in 770, a young man came into 770 to see the Rebbe in Yechidus. He was not a Lubavitcher. Maybe he was not even a Chassid, maybe not a Misnagid, an Olam Mishnah, but he was a Barurian. He was a learned person. You could see this learned person. So the Bachim went over to him. The Bachim used to hang around a whole night to try and get some goodies, some tidbits from the Yechidus. The Bachim went to this person and said to him, "Why are you here?" He said, "I'm going in to see the Rebbe." "What do you have with the Lubavitcher Rebbe?" He said, "I'll be honest with you. I'm not coming to the Rebbe as a Rebbe. I don't believe in this whole tzaddik shtick. I believe you talk to God and that's enough. I'm coming to the Rebbe as a Kabbalist, because I know the Rebbe knows Kabbalah." He says, "I have an illness, Rachmana litzlan should never happen, in my brain. And I know that it says in holy books that every mitzvah corresponds to a different part of the body. I'm coming to the Rebbe to ask the Rebbe which mitzvah is connected to the brain, in the belief that if I'll strengthen that mitzvah, it'll heal me," which is incredibly sensitive. It's if the story ends right here, it's a beautiful story. A Yid should have that kind of a sense. A young man, that I have a problem, my physical body, and I'm going to resolve it by doing the Ruchni's dik equivalent thereof. And he goes into the Rebbe and he comes out. As soon as he walks out, the Brachim surround him again. Nu, was it the Rebbe gesucht? What did the Rebbe say? So he told him this: "I went into the Rebbe and I told the Rebbe that I have a problem with my brain. And I'm not coming here for a bracha for the first time. I'm sure the Rebbe gave me a bracha. I'm coming here for advice. That since the Rebbe knows Kabbalah, the Rebbe is going to know which mitzvah I need to be particular about as a means of remedying my illness. And I want to be mahadid in this mitzvah, be especially careful about this mitzvah." And the Rebbe told him these words, approximately. Obviously, I heard it from Rabbi Glukowski, who heard it from him, and it happened 50 years ago. So the brain, the Rebbe said, is an Eiver Kloli, is a general limb. Therefore, if you want to remedy the brain, you have to choose a mitzvah klolos, a general mitzvah. And the Rebbe said to him, you should be mahader, you should be particular about the mitzvah of Hashgacha Pratis. The mitzvah of Hashgacha Pratis. Now, since when is Hashgacha Pratis the mitzvah? Hashgacha Pratis is the mitzvah on the Mashgiach. The Eibush has to do Hashgacha Pratis. If the Eibush should stop paying attention, we're in deep trouble. Well, the mitzvah of Hashgacha Pratis. So you have to understand the whole thing. It's a general organ. So you have to choose a general mitzvah. So first of all, I want to observe, we have 248 limbs, right? Right? 248 limbs, yes? Right? Everybody agrees, 248 limbs. As they state the Mishnayos, yeah? You know what's not included in 248 limbs? The brain, the heart, the lung, the tongue, the kidneys, the spleen, the intestines. All the internal organs, all the organs that without them you can't live, are not included in the Achei Temimim. Nobody even pays attention to this. Why? Because in halacha, the whole reason we know there's 248 limbs, you can say in taris, in halacha of all us, you have to have reiv minyan and reiv binyan. If you have 124 bones, you're not tamei tumas hayel. 125 bones, you're tamei tumas hayel. You have reiv binyan. There's 248. 248 and half is 124. If you have one more than half, then you become tamei tumas hayel. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry, I don't either. But you don't count. All the important organs don't count because they have no bones. The brain doesn't have any bones. The heart has no bones. The lung has no bones. So the Ramach Eiverim is basically the skeleton. It's not it's not even the living. The Sefer Yetzirah, which we do on Shavuos, talks about the inner organs. And he connects it to the Hebrew alphabet. There's 222 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and they correspond to the 24. He has a whole cheshbon of what they are. The brain, the heart, the lungs, a ganze Geschäft. The point is, there's more to the body than than the bones. So we have 248 mitzvahs that correspond to 248 limbs, right? What mitzvah corresponds to the brain? There is no mitzvah. What mitzvah corresponds to the heart? There is no mitzvah. What mitzvah corresponds to the second digit of the pinky of my left foot? Backwards, doesn't make any sense. Every limb corresponds to a mitzvah. This mitzvah is Shabbos, this mitzvah is kosher, this mitzvah is whatever it is. But the brain has no mitzvah. It doesn't make any sense, right? It's a good question. A good takasha, yeah? What's the teretz? We have what's called mitzvahs klolius, general mitzvahs. And the Rambam brings in the Sefer HaMitzvahs, that the general mitzvahs don't count. They don't count. They're not in the cheshbon of the Mach. We have 248 mitzvahs, but the general mitzvahs don't count. For example, according to the Rambam, emunah is not a mitzvah. Belief in God is not a mitzvah. Knowing God is. Belief in God is not a mitzvah. Joy is not a mitzvah. Joy is not a mitzvah. Tshuva is a big debate, but there's a big position that it's not a mitzvah. Why? Because mitzvahs are limbs. They're not organs. The mitzvah, the 248 mitzvahs are parts of Judaism. Those things that we do that encompass all of Judaism are not mitzvahs because they're the whole life, the whole person. Faith is not a mitzvah, not because it's less important than mitzvahs, but because it's all of life. It's not a piece, it's not a limb, it's an organ. So it's called Eivorim Kloliim, general organs. They're not in the cheshbon of the Ramach because they're too important. And the mitzvahs that correspond to them, tshuva, simcha, emunah, you can find a list of things that are very, very important parts of Yiddishkeit, but they're technically not mitzvahs. The misnagid is going to say, I can't check it off on my checklist. It's not one of the commandments. It's not a commandment because it's life. It's Judaism itself. So this boy walks into the rebbe. He says, I got something wrong in my brain. I need a mitzvah. The rebbe says, there is no mitzvah. Because mitzvahs are evadim, mitzvahs are specific. You're talking about life itself. So the Rebbe says, if you have a problem with a general organ, you need to choose a general mitzvah. A general mitzvah means a mitzvah which is not counted technically in the cheshbon of the Ramach mitzvahs, because it's the whole of Yiddishkeit. Putting on tefillin is a mitzvah. Believing in God is not a mitzvah. It's the whole Yiddishkeit. You understand? Putting up a mezuzah is a mitzvah. Being joyous is not a mitzvah. It's all of Yiddishkeit. And the same goes for all these things. So the Rebbe says, you got a problem with your brain. Find something in Yiddishkeit which is not a specific ritual. It's the whole of Yiddishkeit. And the mitzvah of Hashgacha Pratis is, notice God in your life. That's what it tells him. You want to heal a problem with your brain, you have to heal a problem with your sense of God in general. Find God in your life. Go out of your way to see Hashem in your life. You know that Velvel Green, Olav Shalom. He, by the way, Velvel Green was a biologist, a smart guy.
What ended up happening with it? What was the
At the end of the story, I don't know. That's the story. I'm sorry to break your heart. The story is unbelievable. The story is unbelievable.
What happened to the guy? What happened?
He became a Polish Rebbe. He started out being a Chabad Chassid. And he came to 770, he became one of the guys. And one day the Rebbe told him, you're done with 770. Now go open up your own shop. So he moved to Borough Park and became a Rebbe. Problem is, on the same block where he lived is another Rebbe. So there's a competition. So they have 47th Street and 51st Street and 57th Street. Bottom line is, now you know what happened to him. So you're good. Yeah, for sure. Important part of the story. We were kids growing up, we used to say, did the cat catch the mouse? You know that story?
I know the story, but I like to hear,
So I told you the end, he became a Rebbe. Not a Chassid, he became a Rebbe. Mit Alamed. In unserer Sprache ist Reish Lashuvolim und nicht Sonne Laroes. Das ist nicht kein Mitzvah. Okay, wait a second. So Velvel Green, he lived in Beersheba at the end of his life, and he used to hang out in the Chabad house in Beersheba, and he published a few books on his relationship with the Rebbe. And you could buy them. The best book that he has is in Hebrew, and it's a travesty because he spoke in English to the students in the University of Beersheba. Someone translated the English into Hebrew, and they published a book in Hebrew. The book is so important. It's such an important book. It's called Shalom Ubracha, Greetings and Blessings. What he did was he would come every week to the Chabad house in the University of Beersheba with a letter that he had from the Rebbe. One letter. He would study the letter with the students and give them the historic background of the letter. And he put together a whole book. It's a wonderful read. I own this book, unless my kids stole it from me, which is a great likelihood. Called Shalom Ubracha. That's a greeting in Hebrew. It must be translated into English because it's so important. The stories in this book, he goes through, he had so many letters from the Rebbe. And each letter is a story, and each week he would tell it, but it came out in Hebrew. I mean, I know how to read Hebrew, but I feel like Velvel Green is not resting in peace until someone translates that book in English. But he has books which he wrote in English also. Simple books, not very scholarly for the layperson, about his relationship with the Rebbe. It's wonderful. He's a great writer, he has a great sense of humor. He was a professor and he was a scientist, but he wasn't a geek at all. He was really on the ball. He was cool, very rare. But that's why he's so interesting. He's very engaging. So he has stories that are very personal about his relationship with the Rebbe. And one of the things he writes in his books was he's the story of Rabbi Feller, Zol Gesund Sein, right? You know the story of Rabbi Feller in Velvel Green? With the Mincha. That Moshe Feller came to the Twin Cities. He was originally from there. He was a Minnesotan. And he came to the Twin Cities through the outbreak of America in 1961. And the first thing that he did was he wanted to meet all the important Jews in town. So he got hold of some lists and he started calling up all the important people. And one by one he went to see them and to introduce himself, to tell them that I'm here and I'm taking over the city and you're all going to become my slaves. It's just a matter of time. If you'll agree to sign on now, I'll get you better terms. A Chabad rabbi, you guys don't have shoelaces, but he's running the world. He calls up Velvel Green. Velvel Green's a few years older than he was. So Moshe Feller probably today is, I'm going to say 86. So Velvel Green would probably be 90 now. He was a few years older, maybe 92. He was a professor and he was a researcher, he was a scientist. So he had a department, or he worked for a department in one of the universities in town. He was an important guy, but he was probably then around 30. You're talking 1961. Maybe he was around 30. So Moshe Feller calls up his office, and the secretary picks up the phone. I would like to speak to the professor, Velvel Green. She says, what about? I'm a rabbi, I came to town. I'd like to meet him. So he was used to this. He has a great sense of humor. He had policies. A schnorrer, came to his office. He gave him a check for $18, which was money in those days. $18 in 1960 was like $100 today. If the guy had a big beard and very bushy eyebrows, I gave him $25. If he was a local charity, he gave him $36, which was a lot of money. A fellow calls and he speaks to the secretary, and the secretary goes in to talk to Velvel Green and says, you can come pick up a check for $18. So Moshe Feller says, I don't want a check, I want to talk to him. I need a half an hour of his time. So she goes back to Velvel Green and says, if he's not taking the $18, she says, okay, tell him 25. So she goes back to the phone and she says to Rabbi Feller, Velvel said he'll give you $25. He says, you're not listening to me. I want to meet him. So she goes back to Velvel Green and she doesn't say that he wants to meet him, just no, he's not taking the 25 either. So Velvel's tell him, final offer, $36, take it or leave it. He wasn't even a frum Jew, he was a conservative Jew. He was very, very Jewish. 60 years ago, Freie Yidden were more Jewish than today, frum Yidden. He was very Jewish, but he wasn't, unfortunately it's not funny, it's true. Somebody told me once, you know how Jewish Shalom Aleichem was? He was not even from Yiddish, but they had such Yiddish, the whole spirit. Anyway, so she goes back and she says, this is the last offer, $36. And Rabbi Feller says, would you please listen to me? I need a half an hour of his time. I want to meet him. So she goes back to Velvet Green and says, he's not taking your money, he wants to talk to you. So he says, tell him I'll meet him, but he should understand that he's wasting his time. I'm not interested in the whole business, whatever. And Moshe Feller shows up in his office, Rabbi Feller, with a black hat and a black suit and a black tie and a full beard. So when Velvet Green sees him, so Velvet Green tells him, Shalom Aleichem, welcome to Minnesota. And he starts to explain to him how life in Minnesota works. You got to get rid of that beard, and you got to put on a colored suit, and you have to have a bow tie, or whatever. You have to look more cool, otherwise no one's going to talk to you. And 15 minutes, Velvet Green is telling Moshe Feller what he thinks Moshe Feller should do to do the work of Chabad. And Rabbi Feller is very agreeable, whatever you say. Yeah. He's going to argue with him. Of course, you understand yourself. Anyway, when the 15 minutes are up, so Rabbi Velvet Green is done with his lecture, and now it's Moshe Feller's turn to make his pitch. And Moshe Feller realizes that the sun is about to set. It's late. He hasn't done mincha. So he mutters to Velvet Green that I'm sorry that I'm doing this, but I had a prior appointment. He gets up, puts on a gartel, turns to face the wall, and does his mincha. And Velvet Green writes in his book, I'm sitting at my desk and I'm fidgeting. I don't know if I'm allowed to eat. I'm not allowed to do work. I'm not talking on the phone. I'm not allowed to breathe. By the time Moshe Feller has finished mincha, the half an hour is over. Moshe Feller turns around and he apologizes for what's the word? He laid an egg. He just absolutely ruined it. And he apologizes and he leaves. He says, I had a prior appointment. He figures he'll never ever see Velvet Green again. He just made an enemy for life. Moshe Feller walks out of the office and Velvet Green picks up the phone and calls his wife, whose name is Gail, and I think she's still alive. And by the way, you read this book, there's some very poignant stories. They had a bunch of kids. They started keeping tabs on mishpacha. And I think she lost 4 pregnancies in a row. It's heartbreaking. They started keeping tabs on mishpacha. And she kept losing her pregnancies. And he writes in the book how a letter arrived to their home, personal and confidential. Mrs. Gail Green only. The Rebbe wrote a letter to her and it was not for him. The Rebbe was so pained by this. They had they had a child afterwards, but it didn't come easy. And when you read this book, Shalom Abracha, you could feel not just their pain, but the Rebbe is experiencing it with them. You know, she had a bunch of babies. She didn't have no trouble. She started using the mikveh. She can't keep a pregnancy. And you live it in the book. When you read the book, you live it. You live it. It's unfortunately in Hebrew, but like I said, we got to get it translated into English. I'm working very hard on, but all I do is talk. But anyway, here's what happened. Velvet Green and his wife belonged to a group of young Jewish intellectuals who had a Jewish book club. And every month they would meet and they would discuss a book with a Jewish theme. Like either conservative Jews. This is 1960. You have no idea how much more Yiddishkeit. They didn't keep Shabbos, but they were. It's true. They were very Jewish, and they're very proud to be Jewish, and they had a very strong Jewish identity, and they understood the difference between a Jew and a non-Jew. And they would get together and discuss the book on a Jewish theme. And at the end of their meeting, they would choose a book for the next month. They would vote on it, and then everyone would read it, and the following month they'd get together and talk about it. A month or two before this meeting with Moshe Feller, the book that they read was on Tachvatat, on the Bogdan Khmelnytsky, and the pogrom of 1648-1649. He says the name of the book and the name of the author, which I don't remember. All of them read this book. And it's a book on Kiddush Hashem. Tens of thousands of Jews. Rahman al-Islam, the cross or the sword, they were given an option to be baptized, Rahman al-Islam, or to be killed. And almost all of them were killed. Almost to a person. So imagine a group of American Jews with a strong Jewish identity, but they're American Jews, reading a book like this. And they get together to talk about it. So at some point the conversation, I'm sure they talked about whether these people were normal or crazy, whether they were right or wrong. But the final question that they asked was, are there such Jews alive now? Are there such people today who would give their life not to kiss the cross, Rahman al-Islam? And they all concluded, Nimnu v'gamru anita. There's no such Jews. Moshe Feller walks out of Velvet Green's office. Velvet Green picks up the phone. He calls his wife and he says, Gail, I found one. She says, you found one what? She says, I found a Jew. She says, what do you mean you found a Jew? We're Jewish. She says, no, a Jew like in the book. It took him a few minutes he was so impressed. Moshe Feller thought. He laid an egg. Velvet Green couldn't believe that a person should be, as Avraham Levitansky used to say, he actually means it. And nobody meant it more than Avraham. He was so moved. He says, I found a Jew who would die for this. And this started one of the most beautiful relationships between any chassid and a shliach. I want you to know that I think it was the Shabbos of Nis Mem Ches. The Rebbe told this story at a public Farbrengen in the presence of Moshe Feller and Velvet Green. You couldn't have a bigger kiruv. They were both, Moshe Feller was sitting underneath the Rebbe, Velvet Green was standing behind the Rebbe. I think it was Shabbos before Pesach 1988, and the Rebbe told the story, the whole story, and how moved he was. Anyway, this started a relationship which was incredibly special. There was a period of time, of years, where Velvet Green and his wife, one lived in Minnesota and one lived in St. Paul. See, his house was Pasha the Chabad house. He had students every Friday night. I don't even know if they were keeping Shabbos, but they had a Shabbos meal and people over. They became mamish like partners in the Rebbe's work. And he met the Rebbe. Velvet Green met the Rebbe. And he writes in his book, and I think this is very profound. He writes, I realized early on in my relationship with the Rebbe that the Rebbe is a prophet. He uses the word Navi, meaning the Rebbe isn't smarter than me, doesn't have more information. What makes him the Rebbe is not that he has more data than I have. He's in touch with information in a different way. He has access to knowledge that comes from a different source. So he writes, I disagreed with the Rebbe. I didn't always understand the Rebbe. When they came to issues of science and religion, he argued with the Rebbe. But I knew it didn't matter because I understood that the Rebbe is operating at another level. And for a secular Jew to appreciate that is beautiful. It's special. And that was the basis of their relationship, because he did have arguments with the Rebbe. But he always knew that even though he doesn't agree with the Rebbe is right. Now, how could he disagree with the Rebbe and be right? Because scientifically the Rebbe was wrong. But whatever plane the Rebbe is operating on, his source of information, he knows what he's talking about. So when he met the Rebbe initially, the very beginning, the Rebbe said, I want to ask you a favor. So the Rebbe said to him, I want to ask you a favor. The favor is, I want you to get a notebook, and I want you to record in the notebook events that happened to you, personally, of Hashgacha Pratis. The Rebbe asked Velvet Green to keep a record of fortuitous events. Things that happen that you can't just explain them as coincidental, that the Eibush doesn't navigate. If I'm not mistaken, he never wrote that notebook. He never did it. But he tells the story. Now, again, I cannot get into the Rebbe's head. I cannot understand what the Rebbe is thinking. But I'll tell you what I think. The Rebbe is dealing with a really, really smart guy. A really smart guy. Who's trained in the sciences. So now, the Rebbe has two choices. The Rebbe can bring him to God through the quagmire of science. Debate is a never-ending situation. Or the Rebbe can bring this person to God by just going around it. The Rebbe says, leave the science alone. Every time you see God in your life, write it down. And of course, then you can study the science if you want. It's not going to work, it doesn't work that way. A woman, years and years ago, came to me 770, and she gave me an article from the Reader's Digest. The Reader's Digest is a conservative paper. They have a God bias, Rahman al-Islam. If you have an anti-God bias, that's objectivity. If you have a pro-God bias, that's a bias. So they did a study on the laws of probability, right? Likelihood, right? What are the chances of a fortuitous event occurring? So there's a as they say in English, numbers don't lie. You can do a mathematical study that will determine the likelihood of a good coincidence, right? There are millions, billions of random events that happen every day in every city. Every once in a while, those random events are fortuitous. I had a mindset. Last time I was in Florida, and I really should kick myself because I didn't follow up. This is my third trip to Florida this winter. I came to Florida, I landed in Fort Lauderdale, and I went to Uber. So between the Terminal 2 and Terminal 3, there's an Uber station.
I didn't know it was winter.
Huh?
I didn't even know it was winter.
Well, the sun has baked your brain. I read a scientific study. I didn't read the one about the cold. A kid said, so I go to this Uber station, and it's shaped like a U. The cars turn in to the right, and they go maybe, I don't know, 30 meters, and then they curve out. So I stop, park myself in the middle, and I send a message, Uber should come pick me up. And of course he's an anti-Semite. He has no idea how I look, but he's an anti-Semite. He drives straight past me. So I'm standing here, he curves in, and he goes here. So my first reaction is anti-Semite. He didn't even see me, but Jews, thank God, what would Jews do without anti-Semitism? There'd be no religion left. As he passes me by, so I had to walk, 20 meters, 15 meters. It wasn't a very long walk. I walk around the curve and I bump into a former student. I'm in touch with him maybe once or twice a year. I haven't seen him in 10 years. And it was such a special meeting. If not for this anti-Semite, I wouldn't have met him. Now, what are the odds? It's a stupid story. And 3 times I said, we got to get together and talk. And so far, all we did is talk about talking. I feel terrible because it's very important. It's very important. You're a teacher. You have to be in touch with your students. I have so many students. I mean, most people are my students. I don't even remember their name. My brain doesn't work so good like it used to, but it's hard. But him, I'm close to. I'm really close to him. I love him. He loves me. But it was such an incredible hashgacha. Because this anti-Semite didn't stop where I was standing, as if he knew where I was standing. And he passed me by. I met Yossi, an old friend. We hugged, we kissed, and we said, Sei gesund, and we will talk again, and we're still waiting to talk again. What are the chances mathematically of that happening? Mathematically, there's a number. It's an incredibly low number. The odds of me being in the airport at the same time as him on a Friday morning, and he explained to me how many things went wrong for him to be there at that moment, and for this anti-Semite to pass me by and make me walk by 20 paces as I bump into him. So there's laws of probability. There's laws that can determine how often that's going to happen. And they studied it. And they came to the conclusion that good coincidence exceeds the laws of probability by hundreds of percent. In other words, if a coincidence should happen 1 in a billion, it happens 1 in 100,000. How many zeros are there between a billion and 100,000? 4. 4 zeros. Which means good chance happens more often than good chance should happen according to the laws of chance by a measure of 10,000. Maybe that's the wrong number, but it's something like that. So what's the science? What's the science? What's the math? What's the math? I don't know. It could happen, right? Where they say if you had an infinite number of chimpanzees sitting an infinite number of typewriters, typing for infinite amount of time, they would have written the Iliad, right? But there's no such thing as infinite time, and those infinite chimpanzees, no infinite typewriters. But it's possible. It's called that there is a God, and there's Ashgacha Pratis. The reason the laws of probability are exceeded by the reality of good coincidence is because there's an orchestrator. So the Rebbe said to Valvo Green, mark it down. So what's going to happen? He's going to become less of a scientist. He's going to say, science says this. My eyes say something different. I'm going to believe my eyes. What can I do? Obviously, the science is not going to become wrong. However you deal with it, you keep them separate, you mix them together. But the point is, the Rebbe said to this Yid, I want to give you God and I don't want to argue with you. So every time you see him, mark it down. You want to explain it, explain it. You don't want to explain it. But every time you see the Eibishter, mark it down. This is the Taich Ein Seif Lamata Den Tachlis. Ein Seif Lamata means if we choose, we see the Eibishter everywhere. In our lives, I want to go back to that Farbrengen, where the Rebbe Tzchazeifa kocht. I remember the Rebbe saying, Nem ein Vach von dein Leben. He said it very emotionally. Take 1 week of your life, any week you want, and examine how many times your life could have gone terribly south, and how it worked out so well, And then you tell me, the Rebbe says, then you tell me that you feel like the Eibishter is ignoring you. You don't see the Hashgacha Aliyena. This is the message. This is a message from this Basi Legani. That the Eibishter is revealed everywhere. We have to open ourselves up to see him. Who sees Hashgacha Pratis? Forgive me for saying something very, very offensive and politically correct. Children and Bali Tshuva. The Chassidim, they don't say Hashgacha Pratis, they're too smart for it, right? When someone says, ooh, Hashgacha Pratis, oh, he's a weird person. But you know what? It's called religion. It's called religion. Seeing Hashgacha Pratis in our lives is really the revelation of godliness. It's Gili Alakus. It really is. And instead of ignoring it, celebrating it, bringing it close to everything. I don't know if you remember this, Saddam Hussein. Remember Saddam Hussein? When did they catch him? Yutas Kislev. They caught him Yutas Kislev. And I'm almost certain, I remember it was Yutas Kislev in the afternoon. I think it was Yutas Kislev. I walked out of Achei Temimim, and there was a rainbow from heaven to earth. I never saw a rainbow like that. A rainbow, mamish min hashamayim. It was really in Mizrach. It was very surreal. So this goes back a lot of years. Yossi Jacobson was working with us in yeshiva, and you couldn't have had better timing. They found him Yutas Kislev, and the Rebbe had spoken about Saddam Hussein. So the whole Farbrengen was about this. And he was saying, every once in a while, the Eibishter just makes it easy. He just makes it easy. He makes it easy. He's talking to us, talking to teenagers. He's talking to us. We see Hashem in our lives all the time, but we don't define ourselves by it. And the more we define ourselves by what we see Hashem in our life, the more he'll be in our life. I mean, everybody's life is tough. Everybody's life has got ups and downs. Everybody's life's got good and bad. And conditioning ourselves to see the Eibishter in our life changes how we deal with the occasions in our life where we don't understand what the Eibishter is doing. And like I said, I just want to make it very clear. This is a message from this year's Bas Legani. This is a message from the boss. The message of Bas Legani is, wherever you look, you see God. And if you don't see God, you got to change your lenses. You change your spectacles. It's an avoid, it's a job, but it's a good job. It's very, very consistent with what I said before. If a person has a choice to be happy or sad, what difference does it make? A person has an option. You can look at your life and be miserable. You can look at life and be optimistic. Your life is exactly the same. But living it positively changes your whole life. Having the Eibishter in your life changes your whole life. And this is one of the messages of Basi Legani. Okay, I'm going to stop talking for a few minutes. I book it, yeah? I'm also talking for too long. You see, when you turn me on, you can't turn me off.
Talking, you're going to lose half an other.
So if I keep talking, it's a Rachman of Nelam. Okay, l'chaim v'lebracha, l'chaim yidin. Did we say Tzam Aleichem Nafshi yet?
No.
Shalom Aleichem. I saw you recently. Where did I see you? Where?
Parkland.
That was last time I saw you. I didn't see you since Yutas Kislev. It seems like I saw you yesterday. Anyway, Shalom Aleichem. Shalom Aleichem. L'chaim v'lebracha, l'chaim v'lebracha, l'chaim v'lebracha, l'chaim v'lebracha, l'chaim v'lebracha, l'chaim v'lebracha. Do you know Yossi Biston's story? You know Yossi Biston's story?
Which Yossi Biston story?
With the Chasana. You know the story? You want to hear a mind-blowing story for the Rebbe. Mind-blowing, absolutely mind-blowing. I heard it from him personally. And Baruch Hashem, before he finished telling the story, I already forgot some of the details. But I remember enough of the story. It's an unbelievable story. Rabbi Yossi Biston is a shliach for 45 years, 1975. So this is his story. I'm sorry. He got married, and he went on shlichus, and he didn't have children. For a number of years, he didn't have children. I think for 5 years, no kids. He came from Borough Park. Yossi Biston did. He davened by Rabbi Simpson, whatever the case was, Rabbi Ushpal. He had an acquaintance a family friend who was older than he was, whose name he told me but I don't remember, who learned in Lubavitch. In the 50s and in the 60s, there were a lot of people at Lubavitchers. It wasn't just a Lubavitcher school. It was a school for all kinds of kids. And forget, in some classes in Lubavitch Yeshiva, you had 1 or 2 Lubavitcher boys. The rest of the kids came from all kinds of homes. They came there for chinuch, for Yiddishkeit. This guy learned in Lubavitch, actually learned in 770. But he did not consider himself a Lubavitcher. He knew the ins and outs. He knew the halachelech. He knew the ebb and flow, the pace. His Chassidishkeit expressed itself as follows. Yossi Biston told me, I didn't realize this till later, and he said, I discovered there's more than one person. Every Yom Kippur, this man lived in Borough Park, he would drive to Crown Heights for Yom Kippur. He would come to 770 with his talis and his keys, that was the expression. And he would spend 26 hours in 770. If he didn't have a place to sleep, he'd sleep in 770. He was Bamreb Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashanah was in his own place, Sukkot was in his own place. He came to be by the Rebbe Yom Kippur, and Yossi Biston told me that there were a number of people that he realized did this. Not Lubavitcher people, they wanted to be by the Rebbe for Yom Kippur. And he said to me, when my parents moved to Crown Heights, I invited him to come sleep by me. But if he couldn't find a place to sleep, he slept on a bench. Yom Kippur Bam Rebbe. He was a family friend of the Mishpachas Biston. They were married a few years without children, and he decided he was going to do something. And he never told anybody. He came to 770, and he met the Rebbe walking in or out. He knew when to come, and he stops the Rebbe in the middle of his walk. He says, "Medaftin epis atoivaton farayidin." We need to do something to benefit the Jew. He knew how to say it. Him and the Rebbe need to do something to benefit the Jew. So the Rebbe stops. Vos harayid? What kind of Jew? What kind of favor? So he says Yossi Biston's name and his mother's name, and Yossi Biston's wife's name and her mother's name. They need Achei Temimim. So first of all, the Rebbe corrects him. He missed one of the names of his wife's mother. And the Rebbe told him on the spot the mistake. And then the Rebbe said, they wrote to me, and they already have my bracha. He says, but it ain't going. We don't need brachas, we need paytas, fruit.
The way he said he wants out tough.
Right, he tells the Rebbe, I want a promise. So the Rebbe says to him, I can't give you a promise, but you and I are going to dance at the baby's wedding, at the child's wedding. So he says to the Rebbe doesn't go to weddings. And the Rebbe says, but this wedding I'm going to go to. Akitzer, he never told anybody the story. But every time he saw Yossi Biston, he says, if you ever make a wedding, you must invite me. You have to invite me to your children's weddings. She gets pregnant and she has a little girl, and they have a lot of children, they have a lot of kids. And every time he would see her, he said, remember, when you make a wedding, you invite me to the wedding. And he couldn't understand why, but okay. He says he came once to the Kinnis HaShluchim, and his father says to him that this guy is making a chasana, you got to go to the wedding. He says, I can't go to the wedding, he's a Balabat HaShayid, he only has place settings, everyone has to have a name, I didn't register that I'm coming. He says, no, you got to go. So Yosef says, okay, I'll come to the wedding, but I'm not going to sit down. I'll stand behind your chair. As soon as he walked into the wedding and he sees him, he goes over to the mic and he interrupts the dancing. We have a shliach of the Rebbe. He came for the kiddush. He made such a big deal out of Yossi Biston. He doesn't even understand why. Anyway, his daughter's getting married. It's after Gimel Tammuz. He sends him an invitation. The guy harassed him for years that he should send him. He says, an invitation. And he doesn't get a return card. And this guy's not a Lubavitcher, he's actually a normal person. You send an invitation, send back a card. Most of us, I have stacks of invitations, I haven't even opened them, I just look at the return names, so I know whose wedding I didn't respond to. And it's getting closer and closer to the wedding. And he's very surprised because he knows this person, he's very organized, and if he's coming to the wedding, he would have given him ample notice. Anyway, okay, nisht is nisht. He's walking his child to the chuppah. And he sees him. He's here. So he drops the hand of his chassan, his son-in-law, and he runs over to this guy and he gives him shalom aleichem. He says, you didn't tell me you're coming. If you would tell me you're coming, I would have prepared for you a place to sleep. I would have picked you up at the airport. You didn't send a return card. He says, I'm here, I'm here. So good. Anyway, he tells him the following story. that in the 1970s, Yossi and his wife, I was like, his Rishak didn't have any children. And he stopped the Rebbe in his walk. He said, we got to do something to benefit another Jew. And the Rebbe said, which Jew? And I asked the bracha for you for children. And the Rebbe said to me, I'm not giving you a promise, but by the wedding of these children, we're going to dance. So I said to the Rebbe that the Rebbe doesn't go to weddings. And the Rebbe said, to this wedding, I'm going to go. Gimel Tammuz happens. I'm done. I'm a has-been. He didn't go to Tufshin and Hey Yom Kippur. He was not in 770. And he's not going to the wedding. The Rebbe said he's going to dance at the wedding. Literally, of a few days before the wedding, the Rebbe comes to him in a dream. And the Rebbe says to him, you're going to the wedding? He says, no. The Rebbe says, we agreed that we're going to dance at the wedding. So in the dream, he tells the Rebbe, we didn't agree. You said. You said. And the Rebbe says, you have to go to the wedding. So he wakes up. 3 nights in a row, the Rebbe comes to him. One of the nights, I don't remember the details, he tells the Rebbe, I don't have any money. I have no money to go to, I have no geld. So the Rebbe says to him, a chassid always has enough money. So he tells the Rebbe, I'm not a chassid. So the Rebbe says, you are a chassid. The next day, he's taking a walk in the street, and a friend of his walks up to him and says to him, I forgot his name, you look exhausted. You need a vacation. He hands him $400. Says, here, go to Florida. He says, well, wait a minute. Wait a minute. You give me to go to Florida? He says, yeah, if I go for 1 day, does that count? He says, yeah. Good. He says, but I only need $300. I don't need $400 because the trip is only going to cost me $300. And he tells him the story that the mice with the dream and the dust. So he said, take the other $100. It'll be a wedding gift. And he showed up at the wedding. So Yossi Bisson said to me, when I make a wedding, I never stop to dance. The Rebbe is there. Doesn't he have the Maisamal? Isn't this crazy? Huh? Oh, your brother is married to his daughter? Yeah. So that was his wedding. Isn't that amazing? It's unbelievable. Anyway, Shoy. Okay, we got to sing another thing. I got to stop talking. I got to feel.
You just started.